A fist clad in an iron gauntlet slammed down on the table, causing the inkwell to jump. Alden Varen opened his eyes and didn't know where he was. Standing before him was a man in a gray cloak bearing a coat of arms featuring 3 silver fish. The man had been speaking for quite some time. He said that the Baron owed Viscount Taven 400 gold marks. He said the deadline had passed a month ago. He said that, by the terms of the loan, the Viscount would seize the lands of the Barony of Dornhall, along with the castle and all its people. 4 soldiers stood behind the man. Outside the window, in the courtyard, stood 10 more. Alden's head was splitting. Other people's memories poured into his skull like boiling water. He remembered his past. He had been a professional gamer under the nickname Rave. He had been testing a mod build for the game The Chronicles of Aiden, tenfold stats, free construction, endless inventory, accelerated training for subordinates, another 36 minor code tweaks. He ran the build, and the screen flashed white. Then there was darkness. Then there was this table and this gloved fist. Now he was sitting in the body of Baron Alden Varain. The Baron was 24 years old. The Baron was penniless. The Baron's father had lost the war over the trade route and died of a fever. His mother had died earlier. Of the barony's 3 villages, 2 stood half empty. The treasury had been empty for 2 years. The real Alden had borrowed money from the Viscount to buy grain and had been unable to repay it. The man in the gray cloak fell silent and waited for an answer. Alden slowly raised his eyes. He ordered himself not to panic. Panic kills faster than a sword. He asked his interlocutor his name. The man grimaced and replied that his name was Corv and that he served as the Viscount's steward. Corv added that there was no need for the Baron to know his name, because in a week the Baron would be living in a ditch. Alden nodded and looked past him. He mentally reached for the spot where the menu would appear in the game. The air before his eyes flickered. A translucent panel unfolded, visible only to him. Strength 180, agility 170, stamina 190, intelligence 210. He almost laughed out loud. The normal range for a human was around 20. The modification that multiplied his stats by 10 was working. 4 icons flickered below. Construction, inventory, training, patch, all were glowing green. Corv coughed and repeated that he was waiting for an answer. Alden closed the panel and spoke calmly. He said he acknowledged the debt. He said he would pay it in full. Corv laughed, and the soldiers laughed along with him. Corv replied that a penniless baron wouldn't even be able to scrape together 40 marks. Alden mentally opened his inventory. Rows of inventory slots unfolded before his inner eye. Thousands of slots. Everything he'd ever stored in the game over the past 3 years. Bales of grain, crates of tools, stone and wood, fabrics, weapons. He searched for money and found only in-game silver and ingots. 120 ingots, 10 ounces each. He didn't know the exchange rate in this world and had no intention of dumping his wealth onto the table in front of stranger soldiers. Revealing everything at once meant getting stabbed in the back that very night. He pulled a single ingot from his inventory, making the motion look like he was reaching for his belt pouch. The cold metal settled into his palm. A shiver ran down his spine. The item from the storage slot had become real. He placed the ingot on the table. Corv fell silent mid-laugh. The attorney picked up the ingot, weighed it in his hand, scratched it with his fingernail, and examined the hallmark, which he didn't recognize. Corv's face went stiff. He asked where a penniless baron could have gotten pure silver. Alden replied that the Varen family was older than the Taven family, and that old families had old hiding places. He said that this ingot would cover the late fees. He said he would personally deliver the principal of the debt to the Viscount's castle in 10 days. Corv rolled the ingot between his fingers and seemed to be calculating something. Greed battled with distrust within him. Finally, he declared that he was giving 10 days and not a moment more. He added that if the gold wasn't there in 10 days, the Viscount's soldiers would storm into Dornhall and carry off even the door hinges. Corv took the ingot and left. The soldiers stomped off after him. Alden remained seated, listening to the horses neighing in the courtyard and the gate creaking. The door opened slightly, and an old man in a patched doublet peered into the study. It was Jaros. The steward had served the Baron's father as well. Alden recalled that Jaros had been supporting the castle out of his own savings for the past 6 months. The old man asked if it was true that the master had promised to repay 400 marks. Alden confirmed it. Jaros sank down onto a bench and said that the master had signed his own death warrant. He said that there weren't even 30 marks to be found in the entire barony, even if they sold the standing crop and the tableware from the hall. Alden looked at the old man and realized something important. In the play, Jaros was a character with 3 lines. This Jaros was arguing. This Jaros was tired and afraid, and he loved this house. The world was no longer just a backdrop. Alden stood up and walked over to the window. Below lay the courtyard with its rotten palisade and crooked stable. Beyond the palisade, fields overgrown with weeds stretched all the way to the forest. He asked Jaros how many people were left in the castle. The old man listed them off. Brant Call, captain of the guard, and 7 soldiers. Myrtha, the cook, the stable hand, 2 servants. 12 people in all, including Jaros himself. Alden asked about the villages. Jaros replied that about 60 residents remained in Olkoff Brod. He said that the second village, Berknyapechi, had been nearly deserted since last winter. He said that the third village had been burned down by bandits back when the old baron was still in power. Alden asked one last question. He asked what the people expected from their new lord. Jaros was silent for a long time. Then he replied that the people were waiting for the Lord to flee south, just as all their neighbors had fled. Alden smirked and shook his head. He said he wouldn't flee. He said that in 10 days the debt would be paid off, and in a year, Dornhall wouldn't recognize itself. Jaros looked at the Lord the way one looks at a feverish patient. The old man bowed and left without arguing. He considered it pointless to argue with a madman. Alden opened the menu again and began checking the modifications one by one. He focused on the construction icon, and a catalog unfolded before his eyes. Hundreds of blueprints, houses, walls, workshops, mills, barracks. Beneath each blueprint was the resource cost, and next to each cost was a 0. Free construction was working. All it required was construction time and space. He chose the smallest structure to test. A well. He mentally selected a spot in the corner of the courtyard and confirmed it. The ground in the courtyard trembled. Within 20 heartbeats, a stone circle with a pulley and a bucket rose from the trampled clay. The stable hand let out a blood-curdling scream in the courtyard. Alden clenched his teeth. He realized a second important thing. Miracles here are visible to all, and the miracles will have witnesses, and the witnesses will have tongues. He went down into the courtyard. The stable hand was kneeling before the well, muttering a prayer. Captain Braun ran up with his sword drawn and froze. The captain was a man as broad as a door, with gray stubble and a broken nose. He shifted his gaze from the well to the master and back again. Alden spoke first. He said that the Varian family had preserved the ancestral gift and that the gift had awakened in a time of need. He said that the gift would serve the barony, but that talk of it would bring here those who sought to profit from others' misfortune. He asked the captain if he was ready to serve a lord who possessed the gift and had enemies. Brant slowly sheathed his sword. The captain replied that he had served the lord's father on 3 campaigns and had never been a deserter. He added that he wanted to see the gift in action before he could fully believe it. Alden nodded. He respected honest skepticism more than false loyalty. He ordered all the castle's inhabitants to gather in the courtyard in an hour. He himself climbed onto the wall and looked east, where Alder Ford lay beyond the fields. 10 days for 400 marks, a dozen men, a rotten palisade. Opposite him stood the Viscount with 300 soldiers, and behind the Viscount stood even more imposing figures. Alden felt excitement flaring up in his chest instead of fear. For 3 years, he had been building bases and armies in this game. Now the game had become his life, and the stakes were his head. He was already calculating the next phase of construction and compiling lists of goods for sale when he spotted a column of smoke on the horizon. The smoke rose exactly where Olkovi Brod lay. The smoke was black and thick. That's not how a hearth burns. That's how roofs burn. Down below, in the courtyard, a rider on a harried horse burst in and shouted that bandits from the ash forest had attacked the village and were tying people up with ropes like cattle. Alden ran down from the wall, leaping 3 steps at a time. He shouted to Brant to rally all the soldiers. 7 men against a gang. The captain turned pale but began shouting orders. Alden opened his inventory on the run and found the slots containing weapons. His fingers closed around the hilt of a sword that hadn't existed a moment ago. The gates swung open. The 10 days had only just begun, and the world was already testing his mettle. The horses bolted through the gate, and Alden immediately realized he was outpacing the squad. His horse was struggling, but his body moved with ease. His legs kept the rhythm on their own. The road to Olkovi Broad usually took an hour at a walking pace. He covered it in a quarter of an hour and ran the last few hundred meters on foot, abandoning his exhausted horse. The village was burning at its southern edge. 3 roofs spat fire into the gray sky. In the middle of the street, bandits were herding people into a group. Alden counted 11 strangers, leather jackets, axes, and short spears, near the well. 2 of them were tying the hands of an old man with a battered face. Alden stepped out onto the street alone. The nearest bandit turned around, burst out laughing, and shouted to his men that the young baron had brought them the ransom himself. The bandit stepped toward him and swung his axe. Alden watched the swing as if it were a movement underwater. To his dazed senses, the world flowed slowly and lazily. He stepped into the swing and struck the robber in the chest with his fist. There was a crunch. The robber was torn from the ground and hurled into the barn wall. The wall caved in. It grew very quiet outside. Only the fire crackled on the rooftops. Then one of the strangers let out a scream, and the whole crowd rushed at him. What followed took less than a minute. Alden moved among them like an adult among children. He struck with the flat of his hand, his fist, and his open palm. He grabbed spears by their shafts and snapped them like straw. The last bandit dropped his axe and bolted toward the woods. Alden picked up a splinter of a shaft and hurled it. The splinter struck the fleeing man below the knees, and he tumbled through the mud. By the time a breathless Brant rode into the yard with his soldiers, there was no one left to fight, anyone left to fight. 11 bodies lay along the street. 9 were moaning, 2 were motionless. The captain dismounted and walked past the fallen men, tapping a broken spear with his boot. He looked up at the gentleman, and in his eyes, the old, weary distrust cracked like ice in spring. Brant said hoarsely that he had seen 4 battles in his life, but had never seen anything like this. He dropped to one knee right into the mud and recited the oath. 7 soldiers behind him exchanged glances and knelt down after him. Alden ordered them to get up and get to work. Tie up the prisoners. Put out the fire. He turned to the villagers. The people looked at him with fear. They feared their savior almost as much as they feared the bandits. They pushed the village elder forward.
It was that same old man with the battered face. His name was Egan. The village elder bowed and thanked him, then cautiously asked what the Lord would demand in return for their rescue. There was no hope in his voice. There was experience. Authority in his life had always come to take. Alden surveyed the crowd. 6 dozen emaciated people, gray faces, children with bellies swollen from hunger.
He asked Egan when the village had last eaten their fill. The village elder didn't understand the question. Alden repeated it. Egan thought for a moment and replied that they had eaten their fill at the miller's daughter's wedding 4 years ago. Alden nodded and walked over to an empty wagon by the well. He placed his hand on the side and began unloading the supplies. A bale of grain, a second, a fifth, a 10th, a crate of salted meat, a crate of lard, sacks of groats. The wagon creaked and sank down to its axles. He moved on to the second cart and filled that one as well. The crowd was so silent that you could hear the embers hissing somewhere in the burned-down barn. Then a woman let out a wail and fell to her knees, and the whole village began to sink to their knees after her. Alden lifted the village elder by the shoulders and said they would bow later. He said that today the village would eat their fill, and starting tomorrow morning, they would work. He announced his terms. Each worker would receive food for their family and 1 silver coin per week. The work was simple. Clear the sites wherever the master indicated and ask no questions about what would appear on those sites. Egan listened, chewing with his cracked lips. Then he asked if he could call upon people from neighboring dying villages in other baronies. Alden smirked inwardly. The village head had just ceased to be a supplicant and become a partner. He gave permission to call on anyone willing to work and keep their mouths shut. Alden spent the night in the village. While the people ate by the campfires, he walked to the outskirts and opened the construction blueprint. He mapped out the future just as he had once mapped out the base at the tournament. A granary on the northern edge, a sawmill by the river, a blacksmith shop, 20 houses on the site of the burned-down ones, and a wall. He stared for a long time at the blueprint of a wooden wall with towers and moved it to the end of the list. The wall would be visible from afar. A wall is a statement. Statements are made when you have an army behind you. He confirmed the first phase, and the ground at the northern edge of the village trembled. In the darkness, beneath the flashes of dying embers, a barn 3 times a man's height rose from the ground. Within an hour, the sentries by the campfires pointed at it, crossed themselves, and woke one another. By morning, a sawmill and the first 4 houses stood next to the barn. The village awoke and did not recognize itself. People walked in circles around the new buildings, touching the logs and sniffing the fresh resin. The logs were real. The resin stuck to their fingers. Agen stood in front of the barn with his hat off. The village elder turned to the master and said he understood now. He said that the gods had sent Dornhall either a great blessing or a great trial, and that at his age it didn't matter which, because both options were better than starvation. By noon, the first strangers began trickling into the village. Rumors of food spread faster than any ban. 8 people arrived from upper furnaces. By evening, 12 more arrived from the neighboring barons' lands. Alden added everyone to the work rosters that Jaros kept. The old steward arrived at noon, grumbling that the master had lost his mind, and by dinner he was already haggling with the newcomers over terms as if that were all he'd ever done in his life. On the 3rd day, the population of Old Covey Broad exceeded 100. On the 4th day, Alden turned his attention to money. The debt hadn't gone anywhere, and the clock was ticking. He loaded 3 carts with goods from the inventory, steel axes and saws, rolls of dyed cloth, and salt. He sent the convoy with Jaros and 4 soldiers to the free city of Gravenport, a 2-day journey away. He instructed the manager to sell quickly and below market price, and to respond to questions by saying that the baron was selling off his inheritance. He himself stayed behind to build and teach. In the evenings, he gathered the soldiers and new recruits on a trampled field outside the village. This accelerated training method turned out to be the strangest of all when Alden demonstrated a technique. Those watching him would master it not in months, but in hours. By the end of the first evening, a peasant boy named Tobby was wielding a spear with greater precision than Brant's soldiers. Brant himself, after 3 evening sessions, was fencing as he had never done in 30 years of service and walked around dazed by his own skill. The captain looked at the gentleman without a trace of skepticism. The captain watched with eagerness. He asked permission to select 50 strong men from among the workers to form a permanent detachment. Alden allowed him to select 30. He could feed and arm 50 men. He could not hide 50. On the 6th day, the wagon train returned. Jaros climbed down from the wagon and silently emptied 4 leather pouches onto the table. The old man looked as if he'd been arguing with himself the whole way and had lost. He reported that the goods had been snatched up in a flash and that the merchants had fought over the cloth. The proceeds totaled 610 gold marks. Jaros said that in his entire life he'd never held so much money in his hands, and that now he'd completely lost track of what was happening. He asked his master to at least warn him about such miracles in advance, because he only had one heart. Alden counted out 400 marks into a separate chest and allowed himself a moment to breathe. The debt lay before him. All that remained was to deliver it. His respite ended with that thought. Brant knocked on the door and the captain's face was stony. He reported that the patrol had caught a man by the river who had spent 3 days counting the houses and people in the village and recording them with charcoal on a small board. The man claimed to be an itinerant knife sharpener. They found silver and an unsealed letter in his lining. The letter listed a series of questions. How many men were in Dornhall? Where did the grain come from? What were those new buildings? At the bottom was a single letter signature. The letter was a K. Alden twirled the small board between his fingers and sensed something heavy stirring on the horizon. Corv did not wait for the 10th day. The Viscount already knew that the beggar baron was no longer a beggar, and for the Viscount, a wealthy Dornhall was far more appealing than a ruined one. Alden released the spy. Brant gritted his teeth at this decision, but obeyed. Alden's reasoning was simple. A killed spy was an admission of guilt and a pretext for war right now. A released spy was a message. He ordered that the knife grinder be fed until he was stuffed, then paraded before a formation of 30 recruits in new chainmail and sent on his way in peace. Let the Viscount receive word that Dornhall has food, steel, and soldiers. Let the greed in the Viscount's mind struggle with caution. The struggle between these two beasts bought time. And time worked for Dornhall like it worked for no one else in this world. For the next 3 days, Alden slept almost not at all. His invigorated body allowed it. During the day, he built. In Olkov Bro, a smithy, a potter's workshop, and a long barracks went up. He did, after all, erect a wall around the village, not a wooden palisade from a beginner's manual, but a stone ring twice a man's height, with 4 towers. He'd made the decision to build the wall after the incident with the spy. It was too late to hide. Now it was time to strike fear. At night, he trained the army. He drove Brant's 30 recruits to the point of exhaustion, turning every hour of drill into a month's worth of training. By the end of the third night, the 30 men, who had been peasants just yesterday, marched in tight formation, shifted from a line to a wedge at a single whistle, and thrust their spears through a gap the size of a palm. Brant watched them and remarked that he had never seen soldiers like these, not even in the Count's guard. The captain was talking a lot these days. Overcome with joy, he had become as talkative as a market vendor. On the 9th day, Alden led the wagon train to the Viscount. He took Brant, 20 soldiers, and a chest containing 400 marks with him. He left Jerosa in charge of the barony, and for the first time, the old man didn't argue. Viscount Taven's castle stood on a hill above the trade route, a day's journey away. Along the way, Alden counted the patrols he encountered. He counted 3 patrols, each consisting of 10 horsemen. The Viscount was gathering his forces at the castle. At the castle gates, Dornhall's entourage was stopped and made to wait for an hour in the sun. It was a show, and Alden played along honestly, putting on the face of a bored man. Then they were let in. Malric Taven received them in the great hall. The Viscount turned out to be a portly man of about 50, with the face of a kind uncle and the eyes of a moneylender. Soldiers stood along the walls of the hall. Alden counted 40. Behind the Viscount's chair stood Corv, smiling. Alden set the chest on the table and lifted the lid. The gold lay in neat columns. He announced that the Varon family's debt had been paid in full and asked for a receipt. The hall fell silent. The Viscount did not look at the gold. The Viscount looked at Alden and smiled good-naturedly. Then he spoke, his voice as soft as a featherbed. He said he was pleased for his young neighbor. He said that remarkable news had reached him. In just 1 week, a stone wall had been built around the castle. The village was feeding 200 people. How could such a miracle come from an orphan without a penny to his name? He leaned forward, and the softness drained from his voice like water. He said that, according to the laws of the kingdom, treasure found on the land belongs to the suzerain of that land. He said that the lands of Dornhall were under his authority, and therefore the treasure found by the Baron rightfully belonged to the Viscount. He suggested that his young neighbor voluntarily sign over the find and remain to live in the castle on a modest allowance. Korov, sitting behind the chair, smiled even more broadly. Alden listened to the end. Then he laughed. The laughter rang out in the quiet hall like the toll of a bell. He said there was no treasure. He said there was the Varan family heirloom, and that a gift is as inalienable as blood. He said that the debt was on the table, and that either the Viscount would take the gold and sign a receipt, or he would refuse to accept the debt in front of witnesses, in which case the debt would be considered forgiven, according to custom. He turned to the hall and asked the witnesses loudly if everyone had heard that the Viscount had been offered full payment. 20 soldiers from Dornhall roared that they had heard. The Viscount's face flushed. The trap was crude, but it worked. Refusing to accept the money in front of witnesses undermined the very basis of the claim. The Viscount waved his hand, and the scribe drew up a receipt. Malric Taven pressed the quill so hard against the parchment that he tore it in 2 places. As he took his leave, the Viscount smiled again and wished his neighbor many long years. From that smile, Alden realized he had bought not peace but a reprieve. On the way back, Brant asked when to expect the attack. Alden replied that the Viscount would first try using others' hands. He wouldn't risk his own soldiers, and the Count would hold him accountable for his men. Others' hands, in these parts, meant the Ash Forest. Bands of bandits had lived there for decades, slaughtering merchants along the highway, and the authorities tolerated them because the bandit leaders shared the spoils. He was proven right 6 days later. First came refugees from Upper Pechi. About 15 families had abandoned their homes and reported that armed men were moving along the forest roads, and that there were hundreds of them. Then the lookouts from the towers spotted smoke. The bandits were marching openly. They were burning everything unclaimed along the road and converging on Olkov Broad like crows on carrion. By evening, so many of them had gathered on the hill in front of the wall that the lights of their campfires merged into a single glow. From the tower, Brant counted the campfires and estimated the army at 400 men. Dornhall had 38 soldiers to face them. Inside the village behind the wall were 300 residents, including women and children. That night, a negotiator rode up to the gates. A burly fellow in a captured cuirass shouted out the terms. His chieftain, nicknamed Nail, demanded that the gates be opened, that gold be handed over, and that the Baron be bound. Then the people would be spared, and only the young would be taken away to be sold. Alden stood on the tower and listened. Inside, his mind was cold and clear. He shouted down that he was offering counterterms. All who leave before dawn will be allowed to live. The negotiator snorted and rode off. Alden gathered his men on the wall. He spoke briefly. The wall holds a year's worth of food. Everyone is trained beyond the bandits' wildest dreams.
Not a single man behind the wall will surrender, and not a single one will act heroically without orders. The assault began at dawn. 400 attackers climbed up from 3 sides using ladders lashed together from poles overnight.
From then on, life for the defenders became a matter of routine. 38 archers fired from behind the battlements, and the training regimen had turned them, in a single week, into what armies take years to become. Every other arrow hit its target. Alden worked wherever the fighting got intense. He walked along the wall, and wherever a ladder managed to catch on the stone, he simply pushed it back, along with the cluster of people clinging to it, with one hand. He caught thrown spears in midair and returned them to their owners. By noon, more than 100 bodies lay at the foot of the wall, and the assault stalled. The crowd retreated to the hill, howled, and began lighting bonfires and drinking for courage. Alden watched this from the tower and made his decision. The siege could drag on for weeks, and every day of the siege was devastating the fields, the roads, and trade. He ordered Brant to lock the gate behind him and not to open it until he gave the signal. The captain stared in disbelief and began to protest, but fell silent under his master's gaze. At dusk, Alden stepped out of the small gate alone. He walked across the field toward the hill at a leisurely pace, like a man going to visit a friend. The bandit's sentries spotted him, raised the alarm, and closed in around him. He demanded to be taken to Gvozde. The chieftain turned out to be a wiry man with a nail hanging from his ear. Gvozd laughed at the lone baron for a long time, and then Alden began to move. He killed no more than was necessary. He cut through the chieftain's guards like a scythe through grass and lifted Gvozd by the throat with his outstretched arm before the entire camp. In the ensuing silence, he announced that he was offering everyone a choice. Whoever laid down their weapons would leave alive in the morning or be hired by him to work on a construction site in exchange for food and a coin. Whoever did not lay down their weapons would share the adamant's fate. He tightened his grip. A crunch was heard in the back rows. Weapons fell to the ground in waves. The clanging was so loud it sounded as if an iron house were collapsing. By midnight, the war was over. In the morning, 250 prisoners sat on the ground in front of the gates. Alden walked along the rows and looked into their faces. He ordered the thugs with rotten eyes to be bound and brought before the royal court. There were about 100 of them. The rest were former peasants whom hunger had driven into the forest. He placed these on the labor rosters. Jaros followed behind him with a book, writing and grumbling that his lord had once again doubled the number of mouths to feed. There was no fear in this grumbling. There was pride. Around noon, a rider appeared on the road from the south. The messenger, bearing the colors of Count Osgar, rode 2 horses to exhaustion. He brought a parchment bearing a large red seal. Count Redwin Osgar, lord of the entire Margraviate, demanded that Baron Varen appear for trial in the city of High Rock in 2 weeks. The charter listed the charges: black magic, an illegal army, and the construction of a fortress without the count's permission. At the bottom, in small scribal handwriting, a postscript had been added. The charges were brought by Viscount Malric Taven. Alden rolled up the parchment and looked south. The Viscount had failed to defeat him by the sword and was now trying to do so through the law. And the law in this Margraviate wore a crown placed upon it by foreign hands. Alden used the 2 weeks leading up to the trial just as he would have used the last 2 weeks before a tournament. He was preparing his case. First, he dealt with the captured thugs. He sent the entire 100 bound to High Rock with 20 escorts and a list of their crimes compiled from the prisoners' own testimonies. Jaros attached a letter to the inventory in which Baron Varen humbly informed the Count that he had cleared the road of the gang that had been plaguing the Margraviate for 10 years and was handing the villains over to royal justice. The move was simple. The man accused of black magic entered the capital of the Margraviate not as a defendant, but as the man who had accomplished what the Count had been unable to do for a decade. Then he turned his attention to the rear. In Olkoff Broad and in the revitalized Verkanyaya Pech, nearly 600 people now lived and worked. He built a second row of warehouses and filled the granaries to such an extent that the grain had to be piled up in mountains. He left 100 trained fighters with Branta and laid out defense plans for them, just in case. The captain listened, nodded, and jotted down notes in clumsy handwriting. Finally, he said that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow, and that this feeling was more terrifying than any assault. Alden set out for the capital with Jaros, a dozen soldiers, and 3 wagons. The wagons were loaded with gifts and goods. Harrock turned out to be a town of 5,000 inhabitants, with a stone castle perched on a cliff and a market by the river. Baron Varen's motorcade entered the town an hour after 100 bound bandits had been paraded through the streets. The crowd in the streets already knew who had sent them. People leaned out of their windows to look at the Baron who had snapped Gvost's neck with his bare hands. The story was spreading faster than he could keep up with, growing richer in detail. The trial was set for 3 days later, and for those 3 days, Alden traded. He rented a stall near the market and laid out his wares, steel that the local blacksmiths couldn't replicate, cloth dyed so evenly that the merchants' wives felt it and couldn't believe their eyes, salt as pure as snow. He set exorbitant prices, and by the evening of the first day, there was a line at his stall. By the evening of the second, a messenger from the Merchants Guild found him with an invitation to dinner. Over dinner, the guild elders cautiously asked where the goods came from. Alden replied that the barony of Dornhall had reopened the family's old workshops and was seeking regular customers. He offered the guild the exclusive right to trade his goods within the march in exchange for their support and friendship. The elders exchanged glances and did the math in their heads. Alden could almost hear the creaking of those calculations. By the end of dinner, the alliance was sealed. Gold proved to be a quick remedy for the fear of black magic. The day of the trial fell on the annual fair, and the hall of the Count's castle was packed to the rafters. Count Redwyn Osgar sat on a dais. He was a gaunt man of about 60, with the face of a weary accountant. To his right stood Viscount Taven in brocade, beaming. The Count's judge read the charges. Black magic manifested in the construction of buildings by inhuman means, raising an army exceeding the permitted baronial limit, a fortress built without permission. The Viscount added a speech of his own about how he mourned the fall of a neighboring house into the abyss of sorcery. Then the floor was given to the defendant. Alden stepped into the center of the hall, bowed to the Count, and spoke calmly, as if analyzing a chess game. Regarding the first charge, he declared that the Varen family had preserved for 300 years a gift from their ancestors, bestowed for service to the first kings, that this gift was not sorcery but a hereditary legacy, and that, if the Count's court so desired, it could request the royal archives, where the family's charter of grant charters granting the house's privileges are described. He was deliberately playing up the bureaucracy. A request to the capital's archives would mean a year of correspondence. Regarding the second point, he asked the court to specify the number of his troops. The judge read aloud the accusation, which listed 300 soldiers. Alden replied that he maintained 100 guards to protect the highway and suggested that the Count send an inspector to conduct a head count. He added with a bow that if protecting the highway from bandits constituted a crime, then he requested that the Count send Gvozdi's gang back to the highway to see if the merchants of the Margraviate. The courtroom erupted in laughter. The merchant elders laughed the loudest of all. Regarding the third charge, he fully admitted his guilt. He said that he had indeed built the wall without permission because obtaining permission would have taken a month, and 400 bandits were camped outside the village that very morning. He said he was willing to pay any fine for the haste and immediately asked the Count to officially grant him retroactive permission in exchange for a modest contribution to the mark's treasury. He named the amount, 1,000 gold marks. A sigh swept through the hall. The annual income of an entire county was rarely much greater than that. For the first time during the trial, Count Osgar leaned forward. The weary accountant's gaze came alive. The Count looked at the Baron for a long time, and Alden held his gaze with the demeanor of a respectful neighbor. Then the Count announced his decision. The charge of black magic is to be dismissed pending a response from the Royal Archives. The number of guards is to be verified by an audit. Permission to build a fortress is to be granted upon payment of the fee. Viscount Taven stood with a look on his face as if he had swallowed a wasp. His party was crumbling before his eyes, and it was not the sword, but the purse and arrogance that had brought it down. After the trial, the Count's chamberlain caught up with Alden in the gallery and relayed that his lordship wished to dine with the Baron in private. A private dinner meant a discussion of the true price. At the table, the Count wasted no time. He said he believed neither in the gift nor in the archives. He said he didn't care either way. He said that the Margraviate was destitute, that the king demanded taxes, and that the neighboring duke had his eye on the river crossings. He needed a man who could make gold out of thin air. In return, he offered protection from any viscounts and the title of hereditary bailiff of the route. Alden haggled for an hour and savored every minute. They agreed on deliveries of steel and grain to the Margraviate's treasury at fixed prices, and that the Count would turn a blind eye to everything happening in Dornhall. As he took his leave, the Count remarked, almost in passing, that another man had been asking about the Baron. A strange monk with no order had come to the chancellery and inquired about all documents concerning Dorn Hall. The chancellery refused the monk's request. That morning, the monk was seen in the square. No one in the city saw him again. Alden listened, thanked the man, and took note. The return journey passed quietly, too quietly. People bowed to him along the highway. In the villages along the way, people came out to watch the wagon train and asked to be taken to Dornhall for work. Rumors spread faster than the horses. At home, Brant was waiting for him with a report. Nothing had happened in the past 2 weeks, except for one thing. The captain hesitated, searching for the right words. 3 nights ago, a soldier on the North Tower saw a man on the road. The man stood motionless from midnight until the 3rd watch. A gray cloak. The face under the hood was indistinguishable. The soldier called out, but the man did not answer. The soldier blinked, and the road was empty. The captain would have dismissed it as a sleep-induced hallucination, but the following night, 2 sentries at the south gate saw the same man. The man stood staring at the wall, and according to both of them, his gaze made their teeth ache. In the morning, the grass where he had stood turned out to be gray.
Not scorched nor trampled, just gray like ash. Brant brought a bundle of this grass wrapped in a rag. Alden rubbed a stem between his fingers. The stem crumbled into dust, and the dust had no smell at all. Something that had long been dormant stirred inside his head. He remembered the screen flashing white. He remembered the lines from the system log that flashed before the darkness. There, amid the clutter, was a line he hadn't finished reading at the time. Audit process activated. He decided then that it was about an anti-cheat system. He looked at the gray dust and realized that this world's anti-cheat didn't write letters or file lawsuits. That night, Alden didn't sleep. He sat on the northern tower and waited. The guests didn't come. Instead, something else arrived just before dawn. In the east, above the ash forest, the sky flashed. It wasn't lightning or a flash of lightning. The entire sky flickered, just as a candle flickers when a door is opened. Once, the birds in the forest fell silent all at once and remained silent until sunrise. In the morning, Alden gathered a council consisting of Brant, Jiros, and Egan and told them to prepare the barony for a calamity about which he knew nothing yet. Jiros asked how to prepare for the unknown. Alden replied that they should prepare just as they would for the known, only twice as diligently. He didn't tell them the most important thing. He didn't say that, for the first time since the transfer, he felt not like a player at the table, but like a piece on a board, and that someone had just sat down at that table across from him. The trouble took a 9-day break, and during those 9 days, Dornhall grew by leaps and bounds. Alden decided that if a force on the level of an administrator were to come against him, he would have to meet it at the peak of his development. He stopped holding back. In 9 days, a real city sprang up around the castle. Stone neighborhoods for 800 residents, a water supply system from the river running through clay pipes from the construction catalog, a hospital where 2 herbalists trained by the mod could get people back on their feet in a matter of days, a school where Jaros with some difficulty managed to cram in 50 children. The population had surpassed 1,000 because people were now arriving in a continuous stream from all over the mark. The army had grown to 2,500 men, and Brant divided it into companies and trained the commanders. The commanders, through the mod, absorbed in a single evening what Brant himself had spent 30 years gathering. Guild caravans from High Rock arrived twice a week, carrying away steel, salt, and cloth, and the treasury swelled to 12,000 Mie rock. Egan walked through the new city, feeling the water pipes, and told all the newcomers that he personally remembered how the roofs used to burn here, but no one believed him anymore. On the 10th day, the guest returned. He did not stop on the road. He entered the city in broad daylight through the open gates, and the guards did not see him. No one saw him at all, except those he looked at. The first was the herbalist at the hospital. She ran out into the street screaming that a gray man was standing among the beds, counting the patients. When Brant ran over with the guard, he found only a gray streak on the floor between the beds. Then the school clerk saw the gray man, then 2 masons in the square. Each told the same story. The figure stands and stares, and at its gaze your teeth and bones ache, and inside your head, someone flips through your life like a parish register. The city began to fear. Rumors crept through the neighborhoods, work slowed down, and at the market, people began talking about the gray gloom that comes for the soul of the sorcerer baron. Alden understood that they were striking precisely, not at the walls, nor at the army, but at the people's faith in him. On the evening of the 11th day, the figure came to him personally. Alden was working in his study on a map of the province when the inkwell ceased to reflect the candle's light. He looked up.
Standing in the middle of the study was a man dressed in gray. Up close, it was clear that the cloak was not made of fabric. The cloak was the same color as gray grass and seemed to have no threads at all. There was no darkness beneath the hood. Beneath the hood was nothingness, something the eye refused to look at, and one's gaze would slip away like a foot on ice. Alden slowly set down his pen and asked the visitor who he was. No voice sounded in the room. The voice arose directly inside his head, bypassing his ears. It was even genderless and ageless. The guest identified himself as the Third Circle auditor and reported that he was conducting a routine audit of the anomaly. He spoke in bureaucratic jargon that made Alden's jaw clench with recognition. That was how system logs were written. The auditor outlined the situation. A persistent imbalance had been detected within the boundaries of the Dornhall domain. The carrier's parameters exceeded permissible limits for the 10th times. Matter is being created outside of production chains. Skills are being transferred outside the mechanism of experience. The carrier has been classified as a critical error and is subject to isolation and rollback. Alden listened, and inside him, cold rage battled with professional curiosity. He asked what rollback meant. The auditor replied without expression, restoring the domain to its state prior to the error's occurrence. Alden asked his next question very slowly. He asked whether people were included in the rollback. The auditor replied that all objects within the domain would be restored to their original parameters. The village of Olkovi Broad, with a population of 61. The Upper Furnaces facility, with a population of 9. Other objects would be reset to 0. Alden stared into the void beneath his hood and saw, behind the bureaucratic language, a simple picture. A prosperous city is once again reduced to ashes. 1,000 living people are reduced to 0 values. Tob, the herbalists, and the children at Jaros's school are listed under other entities. He rose from behind the desk. He said that the people of this world were alive and that they were not parameters. He said that the rollback was the murder of 1,000 sentient beings. The auditor fell silent for the first time during the conversation. Then he replied that he had noted a misconception typical of errors of this class and that the carrier's emotional attachment to the objects had been recorded in the protocol as an aggravating A factor. He stated the regulations. The audit would continue until all data had been collected. Upon completion, a decision would be made regarding the carrier's isolation and the extent of the rollback. Resistance was provided for in the regulations and had been taken into account in advance. Those final words lingered in his mind with a nuance that Alden almost mistook for irony. The figure faded and vanished. A gray stain in the shape of shoe soles remained on the stone floor. Alden stood in the middle of the office and listened to the beating of a stranger's heart that had become his own. Then he sat down and began to do what he did best: analyze his opponent. An auditor of the Third Circle. So there are circles, and there is a hierarchy, and there is the First Circle. Scheduled audits, regulations, and protocols. So there are rules, restrictions, and deadlines. And anything that has rules can be studied, and anything that can be studied can be outmaneuvered. He summoned Brant and Jarrus in the middle of the night. He didn't lie. He told them that a force older than the kingdoms had risen up against the barony and that this force considered their entire new world a mistake that needed to be erased. Jarrus asked if it was possible to negotiate with it. Alden replied that it was impossible to negotiate with it, but that it could be forced to reconsider. Brant asked if it could be killed. Alden replied that he didn't know and that he intended to find out. Over the next few days, he conducted experiments just as he had once tested patches. He discovered that the gray traces appeared in the areas of greatest intensity of his intervention, near the structures from the catalog, on the parade ground where the training mod was running. He discovered that the auditor came to observe every major use of mods and that the time between use and the auditor's appearance was getting shorter and shorter. The audit was accelerating. He also discovered the most important thing. On the 8th day of the experiment, he was building a new water tower when he sensed a gaze and turned around instantly. His perception stretched to the limit, and in the blink of an eye, he saw what he wasn't supposed to see. The gray figure wasn't standing on the ground. The figure was superimposed on the world like a patch over a painting, and at the edges of the patch, the world grew thinner, revealing darkness pierced by streaks of pale light. The world was painted on something, and that something had seams. At night, Alden sat poring over his notes and piecing together the facts. The auditors aren't all-powerful, they're bound by regulations. They react to events with a delay. They exist in the very same seams through which his mods operate. His patch also lives somewhere out there on the other side of the world, so the battle would take place on the other side. That meant he needed to learn how to get there. He opened the menu and, for the first time since the transfer, didn't go to the directories or the inventory, but to the very bottom of the panel where a debug console line hung in a gray, inactive color. In the game, it was opened with a key combination known to every modder. He concentrated and entered the command into the void. The panel flickered, the line filled with white text. The console expanded, and a log began scrolling across it. Alden started reading the language in which his new world was written. He managed to read 8 lines. On the 9th line, the log stopped. The cursor blinked, and a new entry appeared in the console of its own accord. One he hadn't entered. The entry stated that unauthorized access to the kernel had been detected, that the anomaly's classification had been raised from a critical error to a threat to integrity, that the 3rd level audit had been terminated. The matter had been escalated. Outside the window above the ash forest, the sky flickered. Then again, the stars above the eastern half of the horizon went out. They didn't disappear behind a cloud. They went out the way windows go out when everyone in a house goes to sleep. All the dogs in the city howled at once. Alden stood by the window and looked east, where a smooth, starless blackness now hung in place of the sky, and realized that he was no longer an error in the report. He had become a threat. And threats are not dealt with by auditors. In 9 days, Dornhall had grown into a city of 1,000 residents, with water, a hospital, a school, an army of 250 soldiers, and a treasury of 12,000 marks. But the Grey Auditor of the Third Circle began to intimidate the townspeople, and then appeared before Alden and declared him a critical error subject to isolation and domain rollback, a process in which 1,000 people would be erased back to their initial values. Experiments had shown that auditors are bound by regulations, react with a delay, and exist in the seams of a world drawn over darkness with lines of light. Alden opened the debug console and read 8 lines of kernel code, after which the classification was elevated to an integrity threat. The case was escalated, the audit was terminated, and the stars above the eastern horizon faded. The blackness above the eastern horizon did not fade with dawn. The sun rose and illuminated the world all the way to the very edge of the ash forest. And beyond that, the light cut off as if severed by a knife. Beyond the edge, there was neither darkness nor fog. Beyond the edge, there was nothing, and the eyes refused to look there, welling up with tears. The city awoke and saw this, and by noon, Dornhall was on the brink of a riot. People abandoned their work and gathered in crowds in the square, shouting that the sorcerer baron had angered the heavens. Some were already tying knots and loading carts. At the southern gate, the crush nearly crushed a child. Brant sent soldiers out into the streets, but Alden forbade the use of force. Force is used to stop enemies, not one's own fear. He climbed onto the platform by the well in the square and spoke so loudly that his voice drowned out 1,000 voices. He did not lie about the wrath of the gods, nor did he lie about the darkness. He spoke the truth in a way the people could understand. He said that war was coming to the barony. Not a war of men, but a war of beings older than the kingdoms. Beings who had already appeared as the Gray Man in the hospital and at the school. He said that these beings wanted to restore everything to the way it was. He asked the crowd if they remembered how it was. He pointed at Egan and asked the village elder to tell them how it was. Egan stepped onto the platform, took off his hat, and began to speak. The village elder spoke of the miller's daughter's wedding 4 years ago, when they had last eaten their fill, of the winter when they boiled leather belts in Upper Pechi. He spoke of how they buried children in a single grave because they didn't have the strength to dig many graves. The crowd grew quieter as the story unfolded, just as a cauldron cools. Then Alden spoke his final words. He said that everyone was free to leave, that no one would be held back, and that those who left would be given food for the road. But beyond the edge of this land, what awaited them was a return to the way things used to be. And here, a war awaited them over the way things had turned out. He stepped down from the platform and walked through the crowd toward the castle without looking back. With his back turned, he listened to the silence. The silence was like a set of scales. By evening, Jairus brought the tally. 19 families had left, everything else remained. And 40 new workers had arrived at the gates that day because rumors of the black sky spread through the market more slowly than rumors of a well-fed city. That night, Alden sat down at the console. He worked cautiously, like a sapper. Last time he'd been spotted on the 9th line, so now he read the log in short sessions of 3 lines at a time, with breaks, and didn't touch the kernel. He was learning the language of the world from the edges. In 4 nights, he'd learned the essentials. In the logs, the world was called the 8 and 7 domain. It was not the only domain. The domain was old, and records of external connections had ceased long ago, by local reckoning hundreds of years ago. Since then, the domain had existed on its own, and its processes ran according to regulations established in a time immemorial. The auditors and those above them were not the masters. They were services, automatic sentinels of an abandoned house that continued their rounds even though the masters had not returned for centuries. This knowledge made Alden's fingers go numb.
You can talk to a master. There's nothing to talk about with a sentinel machine. The machine knows the regulations. On the 5th night, he found an entry about himself in the log.
The entry stated that the threat to integrity had been localized. The Dornhall domain had been placed under first-degree quarantine. The outer perimeter was sealed off until the curator's arrival. Below that was a line that made him reread it 3 times. The estimated time of arrival for the second circle curator was 30 days according to the domain's internal time. He had a month. In the morning, he put the word quarantine to the test. He took Brant and a dozen horsemen and rode east toward the edge. Up close, the edge turned out not to be a wall. The road led into nothingness, and a person could walk along it for as long as they wanted. After just 100 steps, however, the traveler found themselves walking back the way they came. Brant sent a soldier ahead 3 times, and 3 times the soldier returned to the detachment from behind, growing paler and paler. A bird released into the edge of the forest would fly out of the air right behind their heads. Over the course of 2 days, Alden checked the south, north, and west with patrols. The ring was closed. The barony, a section of the Count's highway, and half of the ash forest were sealed within a bubble 20 miles across. No one could enter the bubble from the outside either, and that meant both simple and dire consequences. The guild caravans would no longer come. The Count would send neither an inspector nor any aid. Dornhall was left alone with everything he had managed to build and grow, and with those who found themselves trapped inside with him. And inside the ring, besides the barony, there were 2 foreign villages and farmsteads, a merchant caravan stranded on the highway, and something else that Alden learned about on the 3rd day of the quarantine. A soldier rode in from the western outpost and reported that a column was approaching the town along the highway, 150 armed men under a banner bearing 3 silver fish. Viscount Malric Taven himself was riding at the head of the column. Fate had a sense of humor. On the very day the sky flashed, the Viscount was leading his detachment along back roads toward the border of Dornhall. He was carrying a new-style complaint and 150 soldiers for show of force, and intended to intimidate his overbearing neighbor with a military presence at the border. The trap snapped shut, trapping the cat in the same cage as the one he had considered a mouse. For 3 days, the Viscount poked around the edge of the perimeter, losing men to panic and desertion until he finally realized the only thing he could possibly understand. Food and shelter in this sealed-off world were to be found in only one place. Alden rode out to meet him with 100 soldiers and stopped on the road in the field. The Viscount rode up under a white pennant. In the space of a month, the Lord of the 3 silver fish had aged 10 years. His brocade robe hung loosely, and the moneylender's eyes darted about. He began with accusations. He shouted that the sorcerer baron had locked them all inside a devil's bubble, and that outside, the Count was already gathering an army and the church was preparing an anathema. Alden let him shout himself out. Then he calmly asked if the Viscount had enough food to feed 150 people for a month. The Viscount fell silent. Alden laid out the terms. The Viscount's contingent would enter the city unarmed. Weapons would be stored under lock and seal. The Viscount's men would receive lodging and food on equal terms with the townspeople and work alongside them. The Viscount himself would receive a house and an allowance befitting his title and would sign a document in the presence of witnesses stating that he was in Dornhall as a guest of his own free will. It was either all of this or the Viscount was free to return to the borderlands and eat his brocade. Malric Taven looked at him with hatred so thick you could spread it on bread. Then the Viscount signed. That evening, Jaros welcomed 150 new mouths to feed and grumbled that the Lord collected enemies the way others collected hounds. Alden replied that an enemy under surveillance was safer than an enemy beyond the horizon. He was wrong, and he would learn this later. In the meantime, he prepared the barony for life under siege. He took stock of all the supplies with Jaros, and it turned out there was enough food to last 8 months without any equipment, and with equipment, the supply would last for years. He completed the second wall of the outer ring and incorporated both foreign villages into it. He put the caravan of stranded merchants on the state payroll, and the merchants, out of boredom and fear, opened shops in the city. He pushed the army so hard that the training mode was running at full capacity, and every night he sat down at the console and, 3 lines per session, read the regulations and searched the language of the world for a word that could become a weapon. On the 12th night of the quarantine, he didn't find a word. He found a stranger's signature. In the domain kernel access log, besides his own cautious sessions, there was another active session. Not the auditor, and not the services. The session originated from within the domain, from a point deep in the ash forest, and had been running continuously for 400 years. Alden quelled the panic that followed the dimming of the stars with a sincere speech and Egan's story, losing only 19 families, and through the console, he learned that the world was the abandoned domain of Aiden 7, where the auditors were merely automated services, and that the barony was locked within a 20-mile quarantine bubble until the arrival of the Second Circle Curator in 30 days. Inside the ring was Viscount Taven with 150 soldiers. He surrendered on the terms of disarmament and a guest permit but remained an enemy under surveillance. There were supplies and equipment to last for years, and on the 12th night, Alden found in the core log a foreign access session that had been running continuously from the depths of the ash forest for 400 years. Alden went into the forest alone. Or nearly so. He took Tob, who over the months had grown from a peasant boy into the army's best scout, and he took the herbalist Nissa because the forest inside the quarantine zone had become strange, and such oddities might be right up her alley. He left Brant with the city in a written order for all contingencies, including the possibility that his lord might not return. The captain read the order with a stony face and said that if his lord did not return within 5 days, he would lead the entire army into the forest. Regulations be damned. The ash forest greeted them with silence. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, and by the second day, even the mosquitoes had vanished. The trees stood, both healthy and dead at the same time. The foliage was green, but did not stir in the wind. The stream flowed, but did not murmur. Nissa walked along, touching the trunks, and said that the forest was not sick. The forest was simply drawn carelessly. This was where the world's effort ended. Alden understood her better than she understood herself. They were walking through a low-detail zone, the edge of the map where the domain's artists had applied fewer layers, and where the world's seams lay closer to the surface. He calculated the location of the spot in the glen to within half a mile using the coordinates, and on the 3rd day, they reached it. A tower stood in the middle of the thicket. Round and squat, it was built of a stone, not found in any architectural catalogs. The stone had no mortar joints. The tower looked as if it had been cast rather than built. Nothing grew within 100 paces of it, and the ground was that same odorless gray dust. The door opened before Alden even touched it. Behind the door was a single circular room, and within the room there was a light with no source, and a man sat in that light. The man was old in a way that no old person ever is. His skin was the color of parchment, and through it shone faint lines of pale fire running along his bones. He sat in a chair facing a void in which dozens of translucent panels hung, and the panels turned on their own. The old man turned his head and looked at Alden, then spoke aloud in a real human voice, hoarse from centuries of silence. He said he had been waiting for this visit for 11 days, ever since he had felt a second set of hands within his core. He introduced himself. Once, his name had been Cassian Ver, and he had been the senior overseer of the Aiden 7 domain, one of those whom Alden would call an administrator, a living administrator, not a service. They talked on until late into the night, and Tob and Nissa sat by the wall, listening to a conversation in which they didn't understand half the words, but grasped the gist. Their master had met someone from his own tribe. Cassian's story was the story of the house after its masters had left. Once upon a time, the domain was one of many, and people came to it from the outside, and the caretakers served the visitors. Then contact with the outside world was severed. Cassian didn't know the reasons. One day the portals went dark, and all that remained was the domain, its inhabitants, and a staff of 6 caretakers. Over the course of the 1st century, 5 of them went mad or disintegrated while trying to break through to the outside. Cassian chose a different path. He became one with the core, drawing life from its current, and for 400 years he kept the domain from falling apart. He patched the holes. He suppressed cascading malfunctions. He tweaked the weather and harvests so the inhabitants wouldn't die out, and most importantly, he did everything in his power to hide from the services. Because after the communication breakdown, the services continued to follow the final protocol, and the final protocol mandated keeping the domain unchanged until the owner's return. The services interpreted any development as tampering, any freedom as an error. Cassian explained that the domain's current inhabitants did not always possess free will. They had cultivated that will on their own over the centuries, unattended, just as grass sprouts through slabs of stone. The services hadn't noticed this because they looked only at the parameters, but Cassian had noticed it and kept silent about it for 400 years, considering it the sole meaning of what was happening. The world was coming to life, slowly and blindly, but it was coming to life. Then Cassian fell silent, gave Alden a long look, and said that now he had arrived, a being with authority beyond that of a custodian. He arrived and, within a month, caused a stir throughout the entire domain, awakening what Cassian had been lulling to sleep for 400 years. Alden asked about the curator. The old man's face darkened. He said that the auditors were brooms. The curator was a knife. A second circle curator could do what no one else within the domain could. He can erase not structures, but people. He enters the memories of the living and cuts years out of them, and the person continues to live without knowing that they once lived differently. He can declare entire regions to have never existed. Cassian witnessed the curator's work once, 300 years ago, when a surge similar to the current one occurred in the southern archipelago of the domain. He said that where the archipelago once stood, there is now a flat sea, and not a single map of the domain remembers that there was ever land there, and he alone remembers because he has grown into the core deeper than a knife can reach. Alden listened and asked the question for which he had walked through the forest. He asked if the curator could be stopped. Cassian was silent for a long time. Then he said it couldn't be done head on. The curator isn't in the world. He operates on the world from the outside just as a hand operates a glove. But every operation has its regulations, and those regulations have conditions. The curator cannot initiate a deep rollback as long as the domain actively disputes the threat classification. This has been written into the core since the time of the Masters. The Masters feared that the services might erase something valuable, so they built in the right to appeal. An appeal is filed from the core and requires the rights of a senior overseer as well as a justification. There can be only one justification: proof that an Malia is not destroying the domain but developing it. Living, tangible proof that the core can measure. Alden asked why Cassian hadn't filed appeals before. The old man smiled for the first time during the conversation, and in that smile lay 400 years of solitude. He said that an appeal exposes the submitter. For centuries, his strategy had been invisibility. An appeal means stepping out from under the floor into the middle of the room and announcing oneself to all the services at once. He hadn't dared do that alone. Now he's not alone. They talked until dawn, like two engineers poring over a single diagram. They decided on this plan. Cassian will prepare the appeal and teach Alden to work within the core, not just 3 lines at a time, but at full capacity. Alden will prepare the proof. The proof will be Dornhall itself, a city where the once starving toil, study, and heal, and where bandits have become masons. The core can measure a domain's connectivity, complexity, and stability. By the time the curator arrives, these metrics for Dornhall must speak louder than any regulations, and they decided on a second matter that Alden wouldn't tell anyone in the city about. The appeal would most likely not stop the blade, but only hold it back. Therefore, at the same time, Cassian would begin teaching Alden what he himself knew: how to work in the cracks, just in case they had to fight someone who manipulates the world from the outside. They walked back quickly, and Alden carried in his head a monthly schedule condensed down to hours. News awaited him in town, and the first piece was good. Moithame. Brant reported that the Viscount's men had settled into their jobs, and half of them were already asking to join the army because the soldiers' rations and pay in Dornhall were more generous than the Viscount's. The second piece of news was bad, and the captain delivered it with clenched fists. During the night, a woman in labor had died at the hospital. A woman Nisa had left in good health before she departed, and in the morning, the storekeeper found rot in the 4th granary. The grain in the farthest bins had decayed into dust overnight, a process that wouldn't happen even if the grain were left to smolder for 10 years, and the dust was gray and odorless. Alden stood over the gray dust and understood the message without an interpreter. The curator was still 30 days' journey away, but his shadow had already entered the city and begun its work, and it did not work on the walls. It worked on the little things that make up life, testing not the strength of stone, but the people's faith that tomorrow would come. The curator's shadow worked methodically, like dripping water. Every day, the city lost something small. The hoops on the barrels in one cellar burst. The milk from all the cows in the eastern quarter soured at once. 5 masons' hair turned gray overnight, and they could no longer remember their mothers' faces. Taken separately, each event seemed like a bad omen. Together, they formed a siege without besiegers, and the city could feel it in its very bones. People went about their work, but began to look over their shoulders. They traded at the market but stopped joking. Alden understood the machine's calculations. By the time the blade arrived, the domain would have to be softened. The frightened, scattering people were dropping the very indicators of cohesion that had been his only shield. The shadow struck precisely to prove its point. He responded by restructuring the city's life around that response. He gathered everyone in the square and spoke plainly. The enemy is invisible and strikes at trivialities. The enemy's goal is to make them fear and scatter. Therefore, the weapons against it are order, record-keeping, and stubbornness. He introduced into the city what he privately called the incident protocol, but publicly referred to as the watch over trivialities. Every oddity is recorded. Every recorded oddity was reviewed in the morning at the neighborhood council meeting. Every affected family was compensated for their losses from the public treasury that very same day. Fear is afraid of being counted. A misfortune that is quantified becomes a problem to be solved. Within a week, the city had gotten into the swing of things, and something happened that Alden hadn't planned for. The watch for trifles became a game and a source of pride. Neighborhoods competed to see who could file reports the fastest. Boys tracked down gray spots the way one tracks down badgers. A baker, whose firewood had crumbled into gray dust overnight, hung a sign above his shop, declaring that, in defiance of everyone, he would keep baking, and a line formed outside his shop in solidarity. The city did not lose its resolve. The city was filled with a cheerful defiance, and the metrics Alden tracked through the core were creeping upward rather than downward. Their bond grew stronger through shared hardship, like a muscle under strain. At the same time, he was pursuing his own studies, and it was the hardest task of both his lives. Twice a week, he would go out into the forest at night, and Cassian taught him how to enter the seams. Alden would never forget his first entry. The old man showed him how to defocus his mind and fall through the reverse side, and in a single breath, Alden found himself in a place where there was no top or bottom, only currents of pale light, and hanging in those currents were knots. And each knot was a person or a tree or a stone from his barony. He saw Dornhall as its course sees it. Thousands of lights bound by threads. The threads were what people called love and duty and trade and enmity. From below, the city looked like a constellation, and the constellation burned densely and brightly, while darkness, dotted with sparse lights, lay all around. He tumbled back out a moment later, wet as a rat, with blood running from his nose and happier than ever. Cassian said it wasn't bad for a first time, and that usually beginners passed out. By the third week, Alden was hanging on by a thread for several minutes at a time and had learned the main defensive technique, anchoring. A knot that remembers itself, and that other knots remember, is almost impossible to erase on one's own. Memory was the framework of reality. From this knowledge came an order that Brant considered eccentric, but carried out, as always, precisely. Memorial books were established throughout the city. In every neighborhood, in every army company, in every school, and in every hospital, people recorded the day's events every evening. Who did what, who said what to whom, and who was whose son. Jaros grumbled that they were just wasting paper, but then he got caught up in it himself, and his book became the thickest of all. Unconsciously, the city was weaving a web of intersecting memories around every resident, a framework. On the 22nd day of the quarantine, the curator's shadow changed tactics, and Alden realized that the machine was capable of learning too. In the morning, Brant entered his office and, from the doorway, reported on the Viscount. It was clear from the captain's expression that the situation was dire. During the night, Malric Taven had disappeared from his home, along with Corvus and 2 trusted servants. The gate guards hadn't seen them. The dogs couldn't pick up a trail, and in the Viscount's house, a guest card remained on the table, with a layer of gray dust covering the Viscount's signature. Alden delved into the seams straight from his office, taking a risk and breaking all of Cassian's rules, and found the answer in a minute. On the city's underbelly, a fresh wound gaped open, 4 nodes had not been erased, but torn out, and a trail radiated from them toward the edge like a furrow in the light. The shadow hadn't killed the Viscount. The shadow had taken him. Alden understood why the machine needed a hostage the next morning when the city awoke to the sound of the bell. Viscount Tavin stood in the square before the platform, alive, dressed in brocade, and with the face of a possessed prophet. Corv stood beside him. Overnight, someone had led them through walls and past guards, as if through water. The Viscount was shouting across the square. His voice was his own, but the words were someone else's. He shouted that he had been taken up to heaven and had spoken with the true guardians of the world. That Baron Varen was a sore on the body of creation, and the guardians had given the Viscount the power to prove it. He raised his hand and a gray wave burst from his fingers. The nearest house crumbled into dust. It neither caught fire nor collapsed. It crumbled just as a reflection does when you touch the water. The crowd howled and receded. The Viscount shouted that the guardians were merciful. Let the city bind the sorcerer and carry him out beyond the gates, and then the quarantine will be lifted and everything will return to the way it was, and no one else will die. Alden made his way toward the platform through the rushing crowd, counting as he went. The machine had made a brilliant move. It did not set out to wipe out the city. It offered the city the chance to wipe itself out with its own hands. If the people hand over the Baron, the evidence of progress will crumble on its own. A domain that betrays its own is a domain without cohesion. The appeal will die before it's even born. He stepped out onto the square opposite the Viscount and stopped 30 paces away. He didn't open his inventory or reach for a weapon. His weapon here was something else. He asked the Viscount loudly if he remembered his mother's name. The Viscount faltered. Alden asked if the Viscount remembered his wedding, the name of his first horse, and the color of his deceased daughter's eyes. The Viscount stood there, his mouth opening and closing. A gray power twitched at his fingertips. The machine had paid for the power it had unleashed with his memory, and Alden had seen it in the seams that very night. The Viscount's mind was hollowed out from within, like an apple eaten by wasps. Alden turned to the crowd and spoke.
He said that this was the price the keepers exacted. They'd take you away and leave behind a shell filled with someone else's words. He said that nothing would ever be the same again. He asked Egan loudly so the whole square could hear how it had been, and the old man began speaking again about a single pit for children, and the crowd, hearing this for the second time, listened now as if to an oath. The Viscount screamed and struck. A gray wave surged toward Alden, and Alden did what he had learned on the inside. He didn't try to dodge with his body. He anchored himself. As he inhaled, he sank into the seams and clung to his own knot until the thousands of threads reaching toward him from the city.
From Brant and Jaros and Tob and Nissa and the baker with his board and the Boy Scouts, the wave struck and spread along the threads, then fizzled out within them like a spark in a wet net. A groan rippled through the crowd. Those standing closest saw how the Grey Death halted a step away from their Baron and crumbled to dust. The Viscount struck twice more with the same result, and after the third blow, it was as if a rod had been pulled out of him. He sat down on the platform, began to cry, and asked where he was and why he was wearing these clothes. The machine had used him as a vessel and discarded him. Corv tried to run, but the townspeople themselves knocked him down. That evening, Alden sat by the Viscount's bedside in the hospital. Malric Taven had no memory of the last 30 years. He thought of himself as a young man and called out for his father. Nissa gave him some herbal tea and looked at Alden. In her gaze was the question the entire city was now asking. What would come for them if this had been merely a shadow? That night, Alden went into the forest to see Cassian, and they worked until morning on the text of the appeal. The old man was gloomy. The city's metrics were excellent. The attack orchestrated through the Viscount had failed and had even boosted them. But Cassian had pulled fresh standard traffic data from the core, and the traffic showed a change. The curator's arrival had been rescheduled, not for the 30th day, for the 7th. The machine determined that the domain was learning to resist too quickly, and it decided to arrive before the student outgrew the teacher. The curator's shadow spent a week pecking away at trivialities, but the city responded with a watch over trivialities and commemorative books, turning fear into record-keeping and excitement, and the connectivity metrics rose. Alden is learning from Cassian how to work within the seams and has mastered anchoring through threads of memory and connections, which saved him in the square when the machine abducted and incinerated Viscount Tavin, turning him into a weapon imbued with gray power, and demanded that the city hand over the Baron in exchange for lifting the quarantine. The crowd refused to hand him over, and the attack failed. The Viscount was beaten into unconsciousness and lies in the hospital, but the authorities have moved the curator's arrival from the 30th day to the 7th. 7 days is not enough time to prepare for a battle against someone who manipulates the world from the outside. 7 days is the time needed to decide where to stand when the battle begins. Alden and Cassian chose audacity. If the knife comes before they're ready, they must stop preparing for defense and strike first, according to the regulations. They decided to file the appeal not after the curator's arrival, but before. On the 4th day, let the machine arrive not at a quiet anomaly, but at an open case that the Corps had already accepted for review. The regulations prohibited a deep rollback on a contested classification, and this prohibition became their shield while the investigation was underway. 3 days were spent gathering evidence. Cassian called it a domain cast. The Corps had to measure Dornhall, and to do so, it required a cross-section of everything living that the city had accumulated. Alden thought it would be a matter of crunching numbers, but he was wrong. The Corps didn't read reports. The Corps read notes. The cast meant that the curator was channeling the city's memory through himself. All of it, all at once. Cassian said that a single imprint like this at his age would tear apart the shell he'd grown into around the Corps, and he suggested splitting the burden in two. Alden agreed before he'd even finished listening. On the night of the 4th day, they sat in the tower back to back, entered the seams, and opened the city like a book. The memories of over 1,000 people flowed through Alden, and he held them as one might hold a collapsing house on one's shoulders. In the space of an hour, he lived through the miller's daughter's wedding, a mass grave for children, and the crack of Nail's neck as heard by those who witnessed it. He lived through the mason's terror of the gray man and the baker's pride, and the way Brant wept at night after the oath, ashamed that he had dared not to believe. He lived through Jaros, who fed the castle on his own for half a year, and told no one. He lived through the Viscount, even the Viscount with his hollowed-out core, where at the very bottom lay a girl with green eyes who had died of a fever 30 years ago. When dawn broke, the cast went into the Corps, and the Corps was silent for an hour, and then a line appeared on the console. Appeal accepted for review. Threat classification has been suspended. The Dornhall domain has been assigned temporary disputed development status. Cassian stared at the line. Tears streamed down his parchment-like face, and he said that for the first time in 400 years, he had spoken to the House, and the House had answered. On the 5th day, they prepared the battlefield because both understood the price of paper walls. The regulations will prohibit the curator from a deep rollback. The regulations will not prohibit him from provoking grounds for revoking the status. It is sufficient for the machine to prove that the anomaly is destructive. For example, forcing the anomaly to cause destruction. Cassian dug up everything he had from his 4-century-old reserves. He set up what he called contours of silence around the city on the reverse side. Traps that neutralize gray operations. He handed Alden his oldest tool, the Keeper's Key, granting the right to directly modify nodes within the domain's boundaries. With the key, Alden could repair on the other side whatever the curator would break. Repair, but not attack. The right to attack did not exist in the nature of the key. On the 6th day, Alden prepared the people. He gathered the army and the city and said that tomorrow they would be visited by a judge and an executioner in one person, that weapons would be of no use against him. The weapon was to be alive as loudly as possible. He ordered everyone not to hide in their homes the next day, to work, to teach the children, to bake bread, to hold the 4 postponed weddings. The town listened, and Alden could see from their faces that not everyone understood him, but everyone believed him. That evening, Brant stopped by and silently placed his memoir on the table, asking that if anything happened, it be passed on to his son in High Rock when the edge fell. Then the captain straightened up and said that he had served for 30 years for a salary, but now he knew what he lived for, and tomorrow he intended to live very loudly. The curator arrived on the 7th day at noon, and his arrival was unlike anything else. It was simply as if the world had gained one more direction. People on the streets froze and rubbed their eyes because their vision faltered. In the middle of the main square, a man did not simply appear, but was discovered. He was like the Inspector General, yet as much like a brick as a tower.
His grayness was as deep as water beneath the ice, and he stood at once a little everywhere. Alden went out to meet him alone. As agreed, the city around them continued to live on, as ordered. Hammers clattered. A wedding was in full swing in the eastern quarter.
The air smelled of bread. The curator spoke directly into his mind, and his voice, unlike the Inspector General's, carried weight. Each word landed like a slab of stone. He confirmed receipt of the appeal. He reported that the regulations had been followed and that deep operations had been suspended for the duration of the inquiry. He announced that he would conduct the inquiry and that it was beginning now, and then began what no one could have prepared for. The curator walked through the city. He passed through buildings and crowds, and wherever he went, the world briefly revealed its underside. The walls became transparent for a breath's duration. People saw threads emerging from their own chests and screamed. The curator surveyed the domain with his presence, and his stillness was a torturous truth. He stopped at the hospital by the Viscount's bedside and stood there for a long time. He stopped at the school where Jaros, his voice trembling, continued his arithmetic lesson before the pale-faced children. He stopped at a wedding, and the wedding played right in his face because the groom was Tobbs, and Tobbs ordered the musicians to play louder. Alden followed the curator all day, keeping the caretaker's key at the ready and mending the small rifts in the bonds between the terrified people in his wake. By sunset, the curator returned to the square and announced the preliminary results. He said he had recorded an unprecedented increase in connectivity and complexity. He said he had also identified the source of the growth as unauthorized carrier rights. He said it all boiled down to a single question: is the growth a function of the domain or a function of an error? If the carrier with all rights were removed from the domain tomorrow, would the domain continue to develop? He proposed a solution that took Alden's breath away: the carrier's voluntary isolation. Alden would surrender all rights and leave the domain, retreating to an archival cell. The domain would retain its status as a developing entity and continue to exist on its own. People would remain people. The city would remain a city. The appeal would be granted with regard to the domain and denied with regard to the carrier. The deadline for a response is noon tomorrow. The curator faded away and vanished, and silence fell over the square, where the wedding music was fading out. That night, in the tower, Cassian raged as he probably hadn't in centuries. He screamed that it was a trap and that the machine was simply separating them because together they were inconvenient, that the archive cell was a death sentence on hold. Alden sat in silence, doing the math, and the result was terrifying. The offer was fair within the rules. He checked it 3 times. They were indeed allowing the city to live, and if he refused, the proceedings would continue and the machine would look for a pretext. Sooner or later, it would provoke him, and then they would eliminate everyone. 1,000 lives against 1. That was the arithmetic he himself had always preached. By dawn, he had made his decision and did not tell Cassian. He returned to the city, convened the council, and looked at their faces. Brant, Jaros, Egan, Nissa, Tobb with his wedding ribbon still in his hair. He opened his mouth to announce that he would accept the terms at noon, but he didn't get the chance. The door slammed against the wall, and a sentry from the northern tower burst in, his words shattering the morning in 2. The edge of the quarantine in the north had gone dark. It hadn't opened. It had simply gone dark, along with a chunk of the world beyond it. A gray wall stretched from the horizon toward the city, devouring the fields, the forest, and the abandoned farmsteads. And on the console that Alden had pulled up right in the middle of the council meeting, lines were scrolling that weren't supposed to be there. The investigation has been terminated. The appeal has been dismissed. The Second Circle's regulations have been revoked. A complete purge of the domain has been initiated. Rationale: a direct order from the First Circle. The machine would have lied if it could. The machine did not lie. It's just that someone above the curator had awakened. Someone for whom the curator, the regulations, and the domain itself were mere trifles on an inventory list. and that someone decided not to investigate further. Alden and Cassian filed an appeal before the curator's arrival, having run a memory scan of the entire city through themselves, and the Corps assigned Dornhall the status of disputed development, while Alden received the caretaker's key to repair nodes, but without the right to attack. The Second Circle curator arrived on the 7th day, surveyed the city by passing through the houses and people, acknowledged the unprecedented growth in connectivity, and proposed a deal. Alden's voluntary isolation in an archival cell in exchange for his life and the domain's status, with a deadline of noon. Alden secretly decided to agree. But in the morning, the northern edge went dark, and the First Circle issued a direct order for the complete cleansing of the domain, nullifying the appeal and all regulations, and the Gray Wall marched toward the city. Panic didn't have time to take hold because Alden didn't give it a chance. He overturned the council table, drew a map with charcoal on the underside of the tabletop, and began issuing commands. The Gray Wall was advancing from the north at a pedestrian's pace. It was 10 hours away from the city. He ordered Brant to gather all the people from the farmsteads and neighboring villages and bring them inside the second ring of walls. He ordered Jaros and the scribes to load every single record book onto the carts. He ordered Egan to set up cauldrons, bake bread, and feed everyone hot meals, because well-fed people are less afraid. No one asked why they were gathering inside the walls if the wall was devouring the entire world. People clung to the orders like drowning men to a rope, and the rope held. He himself took the best horse and rode it to the forest, then ran the last mile on foot, faster than the horse. Cassian already knew. Cassian stood in the middle of his tower, and the panels around him glowed red, and the old man was calm with a calmness worse than a scream. He said that the First Circle is neither a service nor a machine. The First Circle is the residual process of the masters themselves, the guardian of guardians. He sleeps while the balance converges and wakes up when the count becomes too strange. Upon waking, he doesn't try to figure it out. He resets it to 0. Cassian said there was no chance of stopping the purge from within the domain because the command doesn't pass through the domain's core, but over it. And then the old man said the word Alden had been waiting for. Almost none. The purge is executed through the core. Only the command travels on top. The local core executes it because there is no other executor here. The core is currently rolling out the purge according to 0 priority protocol, and the rollout cannot be stopped. But every execution has an entry point. If, at the moment the cleanup wave passes through the core, someone is standing inside the core with the rights of a guardian and sufficient grounds, then they can do the one thing the masters haven't forbidden because they never imagined such a scenario. They can propose to the core another way to balance the system. Alden asked what it meant to stand inside the core. Cassian replied that it meant entering the seams deeper than the reverse side, to a place where there are no longer nodes, only current. He said that he himself had grown into the core as a shell, but could not enter it entirely because his body had long since become that shell. Only Alden could enter, and those who entered entirely rarely came back out. Of the 6 domain guardians, 2 had gone in that way, and not a single one had returned. Alden asked what would be considered sufficient grounds, and right then, for the first time in all their nights together, Cassian smiled genuinely. He said they already had the grounds, and that it had been lying in the core since the night before last. A cast, a complete living imprint of the domain that the core had accepted and measured, the memories of 1,000 people. If we present the imprint to the core as a counterbalance, as proof that the domain's account is not being reset to 0 but is growing, then the core will face a choice it hasn't had in 400 years, to carry out the sleeper's command or to listen to the living. No one knew what the core would choose. The core had never chosen before. They put together a plan in an hour, and it was desperate even by this month's standards. Alden returns to the city and keeps the people there because they are the imprint, and at the moment of choice, they must be as alive as possible. Beneath the city, Cassian unfolds all the contours of silence to gain an extra hour against the wave. When the wave touches the outer wall, Alden enters the current through Cassian's tower and makes a proposal. As they parted, Cassian held his hand and said that if it worked out, he would wake up not as a watchman, but as whatever was left of a watchman for such high-handedness. and that they would have this conversation later if there was anyone left to talk to. The city greeted Alden with work. Inside the rings, the entire population of the bubble had gathered, nearly 2,000 souls, including the Viscount's men, the caravan merchants, and residents of neighboring villages. The wall to the north was already visible from the towers with the naked eye. A uniform grayness stretched from the ground to the sky, and no animals ran nor birds flew before it because there was no one left to run. Everything she passed through ceased to be what it had been. Alden climbed onto the platform one last time. He wasn't good at speaking eloquently, so he spoke simply. He said that in a few hours they would try to shut down the world, that they had one way to prevent it, and that this way sounded crazy, to be alive with all their might. He asked for the impossible, not to look at the wall, to look at one another, to set up tables in the middle of the streets, to take out their memory books and read aloud, to sing, to finish yesterday's wedding. He said that everyone who now remembers a neighbor and calls that neighbor by name weighs more on the scales of the world than the gray void, and that today they are all stepping onto those scales. The town obeyed, and it was the strangest sight of both his lifetimes. As the grayness crept in from the north, tables were set up in the streets. Jaros read aloud from his thick book in front of the school, and the children repeated the names in unison. The baker handed out bread. Tob danced with his wife. Brant assembled an army, not for battle but as an honor guard, along the main street and ordered every soldier to loudly state his name, his father's name, and his grandfather's name. 2,000 men gave it their all. Alden watched this from his saddle, already beyond the gates, and committed it to memory, not with his eyes, but with everything he had. Then he turned his horse toward the forest. The wave touched the outer wall at sunset. He had already felt it in the tower through Cassian's contours like a blow to the bone. The old man stood amid the red panels, drawing all the traps onto himself at once, and from beneath his parchment-like skin, his lines of fire were already glowing through his clothes. He nodded. Alden sat down in the watchman's chair, closed his eyes, and entered. He slipped through the inner side like a diver slips through a warm lair. The constellation of the city blazed desperately brightly beneath him, and he pushed off from it and went deeper, to where the knots ended. The current accepted him as a river accepts a drop, and he began to lose the edges of his self. He remembered his lessons and anchored himself to the only thing he had at that depth. To the cast, to someone else's memory that had become his own, to the children's pit and the wedding and the crunch and the bread. He gathered himself around this and stood within the current and saw the purification. It was not a wall here, but a simple line of execution running toward zero, and he did what he had come to do. He unfurled the cast before the core and said without words what he had prepared. Here is the balance. Here are 2,000 living beings who chose to be today. The domain does not diverge to zero. The domain grows. Except growth as a way to settle the account. The current stopped. Everything stopped. In the stillness, something enormous, ancient, and blind turned toward him and began to read the cast. And Alden hung in that reading for an eternity, hearing how, outside of eternity, a gray line stood a single step away from the first lights of the constellation. Then, the core responded, not with words. It showed him a choice in the form of a fork in the currents. The left current led to zero, to stillness, and to compliance with the command. The right one led into the unknown, where the domain continued and grew, and the record of this extended upward beyond the domain's limits, to the place from which a question would one day arise. The core did not choose. For 400 years, the core had waited for someone who had the right to choose and divide the answer. Alden would have laughed if there had been anything here to laugh with. He stepped into the right-hand current. The world outside shuddered. The gray wall stopped half a mile from the outer ring, paused, and then began to flow back, curving northward like receding water. Above the horizon, extinguished stars lit up one after another. In the streets of Dornhall, 2,000 people were shouting and crying and embracing one another, and a bell was ringing. And in the tower in the middle of the forest, Cassian Ver sank into his chair amid the darkened panels, and looked at the chair opposite him. The chair was empty. Alden's body had dissolved at the moment of choice and crumbled into pale lines that faded into the floor. The tower's console displayed the final log entry. The carrier has been integrated into the core with the status of acting custodian. Purge cancelled. The balance has been recalculated. And below, the second line from which the old man slowly rose to his feet. A change in the balance of domain Aiden 7 has been registered by an external observer. Incoming connection. The domain's portals will activate in 72 hours. The masters were returning. Before the purge wave, Alden herded all 2,000 residents of the bubble inside the walls and ordered the city to carry on with all its might, reading commemorative books and holding weddings, while Cassian maintained the contours of silence. The plan was based on the fact that the purge would be carried out by the local core, and that the overseer, by entering the current entirely, could offer the core a counterbalance in the form of a previously acquired memory imprint of the city. Alden entered the current, presented the imprint, and for the first time in centuries, the core was granted the right to choose. Alden chose growth, after which the gray wall receded and the stars lit up. Alden's body disintegrated and he was integrated into the core as the acting overseer, while the console reported that an external observer had detected the change and that the domain's portals would activate in 72 hours because the masters were returning. The first thing Alden realized in his new state was that the word 2C now meant everything at once. He had no eyes, yet he saw every leaf in the ash forest. He had no ears, yet he heard the Viscount's cot creaking in the hospital and Brant restoring order in a hoarse voice among the jubilant crowd in the square. He was everywhere the domain extended, and it was unbearable and magnificent, and he was drowning. Currents were pulling him toward the edge of dissolution and become merely a function, and he clung to an anchor of someone else's memory, just as he had clung to the seams on his first entry. A voice pulled him out of that dissolution. Cassian spoke to him through the tower's console, slowly and clearly, as one speaks to a person trapped under an avalanche. The old man told him not to try to be everything. He told him to gather himself into a single point, call himself by name, and list aloud what made him himself, and not the core. Alden gathered himself around his name, and around the pit for children, and around the crackling and bread, and the wedding, and after an hour of struggle, he managed what Cassian called a baby's first step. He condensed himself into the likeness of a body. In the tower opposite the old man, a human figure wove itself from pale lines, translucent and shimmering, yet with his face. Cassian examined the result and said that in 400 years he had seen all sorts of things, but this was the first time he had seen a core function speaking to him with a sense of humor. Then the old man stopped joking, turned the console around, and they began counting down the remaining hours. There were 68 hours until the portals were activated. All Cassian knew about the owners was what the archives remembered, and the archives remembered strange things. The owners were neither gods nor humans. In the records, they were listed as operators and were always mentioned in the plural, always in connection with the words project and metrics. For them, Domain Aiden 7 was something halfway between a garden and an account book. Then they left in the middle of an ordinary day without saying goodbye or closing the doors. Returning after 4 centuries could mean anything, and Cassian honestly said he didn't know whether to rejoice or prepare for defense. Alden replied that they always prepared for both options at once. Then the question arose, how to prepare for defense if the commander had become a ghost? Alden's first attempt to appear to people failed. He materialized in the square in front of Bran and Jarrow, and the captain drew his sword, while the old steward sat down right where he was standing. It took a long time to talk and answer questions that only he could know, and by the end, Jarros was crying and cursing at the same time, saying that the master could have died like all decent people instead of turning his death into a construction project. Brant remained silent throughout the conversation and then asked only one thing. Can the master hold a sword in this state? Alden clenched his fist and took the sword that was held out to him, and the sword did not slip through his hand. A whole war was reflected on the captain's face, and the hunger for a miracle, which had lived within Brant since the first well, prevailed. The captain nodded and said that, in essence, nothing had changed, and went off to build an army. By evening, the whole town had heard the news, and Alden expected fear, but received something else instead. People came to the square to watch him shimmer and brought their children along. The baker asked if it was now permissible to pray to the gentleman, received a stern refusal, and hung a second sign above his shop stating that he had baked out of spite twice already. Nissa came with questions about the Viscount. Malric Taven began to recall. His memory returned in fragments, and with it came not malice but shame, and the Viscount spent his days staring at the wall. Alden discovered a new ability within himself and cautiously touched the Viscount's knot from within the core, seeing that what had been torn out by the shadow had not been destroyed but scattered. For 2 nights, he gathered the stranger's memory piece by piece, as one gathers scattered beads. In the morning, the Viscount wept for the first time over his green-eyed girl and asked for a meeting with the Baron. Their conversation was long and quiet, and afterward, Taven asked not for a title or freedom, but for work. He was assigned to work with Jaros, counting supplies, and he did so excellently. Alden spent the remaining hours on what mattered most. He was learning to be a steward, not just in theory. From within the core, the domain revealed itself as a vast, neglected estate. He saw the cracks that Cassian had been patching up alone for 400 years. He saw dormant regulations and silenced services. The auditors, after the purge had been cancelled, had frozen in anticipation of new instructions, and Alden wrote the instructions for them himself, since his status allowed it. Now the gray brooms were clearing the skies over the fields and chasing away cascading malfunctions, and Cassian watched it all the way. An old stable hand watches wolves plowing. A day before the deadline, they opened the last archive. Cassian had long known the physical locations of the portals, and had kept this a secret even from himself. The arrival hall lay beneath a mountain at the northern edge of the domain, a 3-day journey at a normal pace. For Alden in his new form, the journey took an instant. He materialized in the hall, looked around, and called out to Cassian through the console. His voice faltered. The hall was colossal, lifeless, and yet not empty. Along the walls stood rows of sarcophagi, made of the same seamless stone as the tower. 48 sarcophagi. Gray dust lay in 46 of them. The last 2 contained bodies, a man and a woman in seamless garments, their faces as serene as those of sleepers. The console above each one glowed with an even light, and a single word was inscribed upon it: storage. Cassian, who had reached the hall through the inner sanctum, stood over the bodies for a very long time. Then he said that he now understood everything, and that it would have been better if he hadn't. The owners hadn't left the domain. The owners hadn't been able to leave. Something had happened outside at the moment of their evacuation, and the portals closed before the queue had reached the end. 48 operators were placed in storage to await help, but help never came. Storage held them for 400 years and retained 2 of them. This meant that the incoming connection and the activation of the portals signaled that the hosts would not be returning. After 4 centuries, someone from the outside finally knocked on the door behind which no one had lived for a long time, and no one in the domain knew who was knocking. The debate over whether to wake the 2 sleepers took up half of the remaining day. Cassian was against it. He argued that the storage was a fragile thing and that ignorance about the guest was worse than weakness. Alden insisted. Something unknown was coming through the portals, and lying in the sarcophagi were the only beings in the entire domain who might know what was out there and how to deal with it. In the end, they decided to wake one of them. The storage console suggested a sequence for waking them, and first in the sequence was a woman. The procedure took 6 hours. The sarcophagus warmed up and the lines on it rearranged themselves. Nissa, summoned to the hall through the inner realm along with Brant and a dozen soldiers, held her potions at the ready, feeling like a healer performing a resurrection. The woman opened her eyes 4 hours before the scheduled activation time. She sat up abruptly and began speaking in a language no one understood. She stopped short, looked at the console's lines, and composed herself. The next phrase came out in the domain's language, clear and cold. She asked how much time had passed. Cassian answered. She accepted the figure of 400 years without flinching, though her hands clenched the edge of the sarcophagus so tightly that the stone creaked. Her name was Taya, and she was the junior communications operator for the Aiden project. All she knew about the catastrophe was what she'd managed to see during the minutes of the evacuation. The external node of the domain network was collapsing. It wasn't a war or a malfunction, but something referred to in the records as a divergence. The domains were being cut off from the node one by one to prevent the divergence from spreading, and Aiden 7 was cut off earlier than expected, causing a backlog for exit. She went into storage as number 47. She knew no more about what was happening outside than the others did, but she knew the essentials about the protocols. She looked at the incoming connection log and said that the connection's signature was non-standard. This isn't an operator's protocol, nor is it a service protocol. It's something cobbled together from bits of both, like building a raft after a shipwreck. Whoever was knocking on the door had taught itself the language of the door. There were 3 hours left to prepare, and Alden managed them as best he could. He stationed Brant's army in the arrivals hall, not for battle, but for representation, and ordered them to polish their armor to a shine. If the guest looks at the indicators, let him see order. Cassian deployed all the units he had around the hall. Taya stood at the communications console, her fingers flying over the keys as she extracted from the protocol fragments of data about what lay on the other side. There were 2 fragments. There was little energy on the other side. and there was one living being on the other side. One. The portal came to life without a thunderclap. Simply the arch at the end of the hall ceased to be stone and became a door, and light stood within the door, and a man stepped out of the light. He was young and thin to the point of transparency, dressed in the same seamless clothing as the sleepers, but patched with rough stitches. Over his shoulders he carried a box assembled from debris, with strands of cold fire protruding from it. He took 3 steps and saw the line of soldiers and the flickering figures of Alden and Cassian with their glowing bones, and Taya at the console. And this man, who had survived who knows what, sat down on the floor of the hall and wept like a child. They gave him water and food, and he ate just as Alden himself had once eaten on the first day at Alder Ford. An hour later, he was able to speak coherently. His name was Yule, and he had been born on the outside 300 years after the catastrophe. According to him, there was no longer a network, no nodes, and no project on the outside. The divergence had devoured the operator's outside world almost entirely, leaving behind an archipelago of dying fragments. The people on the outside hadn't been operators for a long time. They were the descendants of the survivors and lived among the ruins of the infrastructure without understanding it, just as birds live among the ruins of a cathedral. Yul was one of those they called divers, those who crawl into dead systems in search of crumbs of energy and knowledge. For 12 years, he had been piecing together a transmitter from the wreckage and searching old maps for domains that had been cut off before the divergence and might therefore have survived. 8 and 7 was the 40th address he'd knocked on. The 39 before it had answered with silence. He asked in a trembling voice if it was true that grass grew here. They led him out from beneath the mountain. The sun was setting and the wind blew through real grass, and Yule knelt there, gazing, unable to take his eyes off it. Meanwhile, Alden looked at him, and deep within his core pieced together a new picture of the world with cold clarity. There were no returning masters with their rights and courts. There was a dead metropolis, and there was their domain, which turned out to be not a fragment, but perhaps the last intact garden. And there was a door that was now open in both directions, and beyond the door were dying people who, sooner or later, would find their way by following Yule's trail. Some would come like Yule, empty-handed and with tear-filled eyes. Others will come differently. A raft of protocols can be assembled both for knocking and for breaking in. In the evening, a council of an unprecedented composition was held in the tower. The flickering caretaker, the old man rooted in the core, the awakened communications officer, a guest from outside, and Brant and Jaros from among the people. Taya spoke sternly. The protocol orders us to close the portal, change the door's signature, and carry on living in silence as we have before. One hungry person is touching, but 10,000 hungry people spell the end of the garden. Cassian was silent and looked at Alden, and Alden understood that look. The old man had already chosen the strategy of invisibility once and paid for it with 400 years of solitude. G, to everyone's surprise, was the first among the men to speak. He said that he had lived through times when the granaries were empty and times when they were full, and that he had firmly learned one thing. A granary that is merely locked up eventually falls to the rats. Granary lives when things are taken from it and put into it. Brant added, in his typically military terse manner, that any door that cannot be held is better to hold oneself with a garrison than to find it broken down one day. Alden listened to them, absorbing their words with his whole being. 2,000 knots burned steadily and warmly beneath the mountain. He made a decision, spoke it aloud, and asked Taya to record it in the core as the first law of the open door. The door remains open. Entering through the door is a contract. Everyone who enters receives what everyone once received in Dornhall: food, shelter, work, and a place in the Book of Remembrance. And everyone who enters accepts the law of the house. Taya asked what would happen to those who came without a contract. Alden replied that for them, the house has a caretaker who has already out-argued the end of the world once. That night, after the council had dispersed, he remained alone in the arrival hall and gazed for a long time at Yule, who was sleeping by the portal, curled up on a blanket like a frozen dog. Then he shifted his gaze to the second sarcophagus, where the last sleeping operator awaited his hour.
The console above the man glowed steadily. There was no name on it, only a title was listed, and Alden had read it 3 times during his first visit, but hadn't told anyone yet. The line stated that the project's chief architect, Aiden, was in storage, the one who would design this world.
Taya, the communications officer, was roused and explained that the operator's outside world had perished due to and the domain had been cut off during the evacuation. The incoming connection signature was makeshift. Yul, a hungry diver and descendant of the survivors from the outside, came through the portal. He had spent 12 years searching for surviving domains, and Aiden's number 7 turned out to be the only one still alive, out of 40 addresses. The council decided not to close the door and passed the first open door law regarding agreements for those entering. Sooner or later, others, including those with ill intent, would arrive from outside. In the second sarcophagus, the last sleeper awaits awakening. Aiden, the senior architect of the project and creator of this world. They decided not to wake the architect just yet, and Alden himself pushed through the decision against the curiosity of everyone else. His reasoning was simple, and he shared it only with Cassian. The man who drew this world would awaken to a world that had been redrawn without him. Before introducing the creator to this self-governance, it must be firmly established, so firmly that it cannot be undone with a stroke of the elder's authority. Cassian listened and remarked that the superintendent had learned to think just as he himself had 400 years ago, and it was unclear whether that was a compliment or a diagnosis. The following months were spent building what Geros in the ledgers dubbed the vestibule of the world. Next to the arrival hall, the second city sprang up. Port Hall, quarantine facilities, language schools, employment offices, and a hospital twice the size of Dorn Hall's. Alden paved the road from the northern mountain to Dorn Hall with stone in 3 nights, and supply convoys set out along it. Yule went outside and returned a month later, bringing the first group, 42 people from his community, including his mother and sister. The people from outside turned out to be shadows of human beings. Their skin was gray from living in the ruins, they were frightened by the open sky, and didn't know how to eat their fill. After a month of quarantine, bread, and work, the shadows began to transform back, and Alden saw in his mind's eye how their dim knots gathered light and grew, like threads, into the greater constellation. Then other waves followed. Yul gave his homemade transmitter to Tay, and she turned it into a real beacon, which broadcast on the divers' frequencies. Communities of 30 or 100 souls arrived. Solitaries with terrifying eyes arrived. By the end of half a year, 1,500 people had passed through the door, and the domain devoured them, digested them, and grew. Dorn Hall became the capital of a small country consisting of 4 cities. Brant's army had grown to 1,000 fighters, and half the recruits were from outside the realm. The captain grumbled that soon, in his ranks, only the veterans of the first assault would remember the old Dorn Hall, and he instituted mandatory evenings of reading commemorative books for the new recruits. Trouble came in the 7th month of the open border, and it came just as Alden had expected, on their trail. It wasn't just the starving who had heard the Tai lighthouse. At first, 3 scouts were caught in the stream of arrivals, men with good teeth and well-fed muscles beneath their rags, who were trying a little too hard to look like starving people. On the inside, their knots were marked with a strange symbol resembling a brand, and Alden politely settled all 3 in a separate quarantine house and waited for the next development. The next development arrived a month later at the portal itself. From the other side, Taya removed an incoming package from the door, prepared competently according to the old operator protocols. The package was an ultimatum. It was signed in the name of the Heirs Consortium, and the official notice stated that all assets of the Aiden project, including Domain 7, belonged to the consortium by right of infrastructure succession. The current administration of the domain was declared illegal. The domain was ordered to open the door for an inventory and transfer control to authorized representatives. In the event of refusal, the consortium reserves the right to enforce compliance. After reading this, Yul turned pale and shared what he knew. The heirs were the most powerful gang in the outer ruins. They were not savages, but descendants of the node's technical staff who had managed to preserve their knowledge. They controlled the energy and water of the 3 shards and ruled there as a disease rules. When they arrived at a new shard, they did not burn it. They put it on the meter. The council gathered in Porthole, and it was no longer the Barony's Council, but the Nation's Council. Taya proposed changing the door's access code and going off the grid. Brant proposed meeting the envoys in formation. Cassian remained silent and looked at Alden, and Alden stared into the core. He wasn't thinking about the heirs. He was thinking about the 39 dead addresses on Yule's list, about the shards on the counter, and about the fact that the door to his house was the only one in the world behind which grass was growing. Hiding meant leaving the outside world of disease behind forever. He announced the decision, and the decision was the third option, not to hide or defend, to go out to meet them. The domain would officially refuse the consortium's request and at the same time offer the outer shards what Dornhall had once offered the Nails Bandits, a choice. Any community from outside could enter into a treaty with the domain. Food, seeds, knowledge, and medical care in exchange for the law. We won't close the door because the door itself is our answer. Taya asked if the overseer understood that he was declaring war on the only organized force in the outside world. Alden replied that war had been declared by those who had put life on the line, and he was merely refusing to pay. Preparations took 3 months and were carried out on both sides of the door. Inside, Cassian and Alden did what no one had done since the days of the operators. They learned to fold the passageways. The portal was no longer a hole that could be broken through. The portal became a corridor that the keeper could bend and lock off segment by segment, filling it with contours of silence. Outside, Yule and volunteers from the newcomers were at work. They carried not weapons, but a rumor through the ruins, a rumor of a door behind which lay grass and maps of the roads leading to it. Communities were moving away from the dead zones, and for the first time in generations, the heirs saw the very object of their reckoning slipping away from beneath their counters. People. The consortium struck its first real blow in the 11th month, not at the portal, on the road leading to it. A detachment of 400 fighters armed with energy weapons from the hub's looted arsenals intercepted a column of 700 settlers right at the entrance in order to demonstratively return them to the counter. The calculation was correct by the standards of the ruins. By the standards of the door, it was a mistake. The door opened outward, not inward. For the first time in 400 years, an army emerged from Domain 8 and 7. 1,000 of Brant's soldiers, clad in armor forged from an endless inventory and trained by a mod to a level the outside world could not recall, and the Overseer emerged with them. Alden stepped over the threshold of his world and was momentarily blinded. Outside, his omniscience ended. Here, he was once again just a man in a shimmering body, with the key to his home on his back. He looked up at the gray sky over the ruins, at the columns of captives standing by the alien vehicles, and at the 400 gun barrels trained on the door, and he told Brant what he had once said at the Nails camp. Offer them a choice, just once. Over the months the door had been open, 1,500 outsiders had entered through the portal, and the city of Port Hall had grown. Alden's country now comprised 4 cities and an army of 1,000, though it had been decided not to awaken the architect until the new order was consolidated. The Consortium of Heirs, a gang of descendants of technical personnel ruling the outer shards through the counters, appeared and asserted its rights to the domain, accompanied by an ultimatum. Alden chose not to defend, but to make a counter-proposal to the external communities to enter into a treaty at home, which led to an outflow of people from the heirs, and the portal was transformed into a controlled corridor. The heirs intercepted a column of 700 settlers with a detachment of 400 fighters, and Brant's army, along with the Overseer, stepped outside the gate for the first time, into an area where Alden's core forces had no influence. The situation outside worked differently than at Gvozdy's camp, and Alden realized this within the first few minutes. The bandits were starving people, led by an Ataman. The consortium fighters were believers of the Church of the Counter. They had grown up in a world where energy equaled the right to life, and whoever held the switch held the truth. When Brant suggested they lay down their weapons, their commander, clad in glossy black armor, laughed into his amplifier and replied that the savages hiding in the grass were about to learn what true power was, and 400 barrels fired. Alden took the first volley head on. The caretaker's key didn't work from the outside, but something else did. His body was woven from lines, and he stretched himself into a curtain in front of the formation. The energy of the volley passed through him, and for a few seconds he ceased to be anyone at all before reassembling himself at the cost of pain he'd never even felt in his seams. Those few seconds were enough for Brant. The captain refused to engage in a head-on battle against the machines. His 1,000 soldiers scattered through the ruins like mercury, and a war began that the heirs had never been taught. A war fought by people whose speed and accuracy were 10 times greater than those of people accustomed to an enemy that stood still and cowered. Rough and tumble training against glossy armor. By sunset, it was all over. A third of the consortium's detachment lay in the ruins. A third fled. A third knelt among their machines watching as savages emerged from the grass to bandage their own wounded. The captive settlers were led out of their cages and the column moved toward the door. 700 people passing by the flickering Overseer fell to their knees, and Alden wearily ordered Brant to stop this immediately because a home begins with the fact that no one crawls inside it. The war continued for a year after that, and it unfolded strangely. The consortium could not take the door. It tried 3 times, and 3 times Cassian's corridor devoured the assault teams. not killing them, but spitting them back out, stripped bare and without vehicles. Alden could not and would not conquer the ruins. Instead of armies, the roads fought. The domains set up domes outside, surrounding the station's door, domes where anyone who arrived received food and medical care, as well as seeds of that very grass, which, to the surprise of everyone except Alden, began to grow in the dead outer soil if it was cultivated from the domain's seeds. The station's heirs burned them down. The domain erected new ones overnight because free construction outpaced any war economy. People from the fragments watched this competition and drew their own conclusions, and the consortium's coffers ran dry. A year later, of the 3 fragments under the heirs' control, only one remained, and on that fragment their own hunger riot began. The resolution came from an unexpected source. In the midst of the siege of the last fragment, a lone transport bearing a white rag arrived at the gate, and out stepped a woman in her 60s with a stern face and the insignia of a chief engineer of the consortium. Her name was Mara Din, and she was a true heir by blood, the great-great-granddaughter of the shift supervisor at that very node. She asked to speak with the overseer in private, and their conversation lasted all night. She showed no remorse, and Alden appreciated that. She spoke like an engineer. The meter was not driven by greed, but by a method to stretch the dying power sources over additional generations. And the method had worked for 100 years before rotting away, just as everything that relies solely on fear eventually rots. She saw the numbers. Her world had lost to his world not in battle, but in the arithmetic of hope. She had come not to surrender, but to convey what no one else knew anymore except her, the reason. The true reason for the divergence that had caused the metropolis to perish. She placed the node's memory crystal on the table and said that her great-great-grandfather had preserved the logs from the final day. The divergence did not come from outside. The divergence was born within one of the project's domains, in a domain where the local inhabitants had also developed free will. The operators of that domain panicked and decided to erase that free will with a global rollback. And free will, in self-defense, entered the core, and through the core into the network, spreading through the nodes, not as an invader, but as a fire in which both sides were consumed. The network severed its connections, severed itself, and died. Mara looked at the flickering figure across from her and told him why she had really come. People on the outside know that the same thing happened in 8 and 7. A being with foreign rights had taken root in the core. She wanted to hear from him directly how he differed from that fire, because if there was no difference, then everything he had built was just a beautiful pyre. Alden was silent for a long time, then he answered, not to himself. He told her about the pit for children, the patrol of trifles, the memorial books, and how the city beneath the gray wall set the tables. He said the difference wasn't in him. That fire was a will that stood alone against erasure. His case was a will that wasn't left alone. All he knows how to do is make sure that no one in his house is left alone against the erasure. He has no other guarantees. Mara Den thought about it until morning. In the morning, she asked for 2 contracts. One for herself, granting her the right to work as an engineer in Porthole, and a general one for the last remnant of the consortium, regarding entry into the house on standard terms, with no privileges for the former owners of the meter. The war ended with a signature, and a month later, when the first convoys from the last remnant passed through the door and Jaros personally entered Alden, the country's 10,000th resident, into the register, he gathered his inner circle in the arrival hall and said that the time had come. The house stands, the door holds, the law is working, it's time to wake up the one who drew all this and hold him accountable. The procedure began at dawn. For 6 hours, the sarcophagus rearranged the lines while the entire inner circle stood around it. Cassian, Taya, Brant, Jaros, Nisa, Yule, Mara, and even Viscount Taven, whom Alden had summoned personally because he believed the creator should be shown not only the successes. At the 6th hour, the lid melted away. The project's chief architect, Aiden, opened his eyes and sat up, revealing himself to be a short, elderly man with the attentive eyes of a very weary teacher. He scanned the hall, the shimmering figure of Alden, and the array of faces. He did not ask how much time had passed. He looked for a long time and saw things as those who had drawn them saw them. Then he spoke, his voice soft. He said that before entering hibernation, he had managed to see on the instruments that the network was failing and had lain down to die along with his world. But he woke up in a world where his world was alive and full of unfamiliar living faces, and where, at the core, someone warm sat instead of the regulations. And he asked a single question, and for some reason he asked it not of Alden but of Jaros. He asked the old man if life was good here. Jaros thought for a moment and answered as he always did, that things had been up and down, that now the granaries were full and the children were in school, and that, personally, for the first time in his old age, he wasn't afraid of anyone. The architect nodded and closed his eyes for a moment. And when he opened them, he looked at Alden and spoke words that sent a jolt through the currents inside the core. He said that the Aiden project was not created as a garden or as an account book. The project was created as a question. The operators were searching for the answer. Could a drawn world become real? Metropolis perished without ever learning the answer, and now he had awakened within the answer. The architect's words hung heavy in the room, and no one dared to speak first until the architect himself broke the silence. He asked for a year, not for power nor for reports. He asked for permission to live in this world for a year as an ordinary resident before deciding what to do with the creator's rights he still possessed. Alden exchanged a glance with Cassian, granted his request, and added a single condition: to live at home according to the common agreement. The architect smiled for the first time and said he had never heard a better condition in his entire career. His name was Ansel. He asked that his last name be forgotten, along with his title. Alden later recalled the year that followed as the strangest and most peaceful year of both their lives. Ansel settled in Dornhall with the baker, registered at the employment office, and applied to be an apprentice at Jairus' school for the positions of arithmetic and drawing teacher. The creator of the world taught the children the multiplication table and laughed until he cried at the baker's second blackboard. He traveled the country on foot. He sat in on the meetings of the Small Matters Watch. He asked to join the road crew and spent a month laying stones. In the evenings, he would talk at length with everyone he came across. With Brant, about fear. With Nissa, about death. With the Viscount, about guilt. With Mara, about counters. With Yule, about what the grass looked like in his dreams before he saw the real thing. And only with Alden did he spend the entire year not talking about the important things, but about trivialities. And Alden put up with it because he recognized himself in this approach. Ansel was taking a mold, not through the core, with his feet and ears. Over the course of that year, the country had reached a point of change that no longer required an overseer at every turn. The Council of Lands, composed of elected representatives from all cities and communities, took over all civil administration from Alden, and Jaros, retiring, handed the books over to his successor from the outer regions and wept. Taya and Mara established regular communication through the door with the distant frequencies, and now voices, not silence, filled the airwaves. For the first time in 400 years, Cassian left his tower for good and moved to Port Hall to teach at the school for overseers that he and Ansel had founded, where they had enrolled their first 10 students, half from the local population and half from the outsiders. The core currents could no longer be held by just 2 pairs of hands. Exactly 1 year later, to the day, Ansel arrived at the arrival hall where it all began and asked to gather the same circle. He stood before them in patched work clothes with chalk dust on his sleeve and spoke like a presenter. He said he had conducted an audit more thoroughly than any auditor. He was obliged to announce the result. By all the criteria set by the operators, this world had ceased to be a project. What had been drawn had become real, not because the paint had come to life, but because those who had been drawn had begun to draw on their own, and were drawing better than their creators. In the real world, there is no architect with creator's rights. Therefore, he made a decision. He summoned a console in midair, one none of them had ever seen, and in full view of everyone, accessed his own status and deleted it. The lines of creator's rights crumbled and fell to the floor, just as Alden's body had once done. Ansel staggered and Nissa caught him. He laughed and said that for the first time in over 200 years, he weighed as much as he did. From now on, he was simply a teacher of arithmetic and drawing, and he asked them not to be late for class tomorrow. Then he turned to Alden and said one last thing. There was one open line left in the core, and only Alden himself could close it. The status of acting overseer was temporary by definition. The core awaits a decision. Alden could remain in the core forever and become what Cassian had become, only deeper, or the core is capable of the opposite, reassembling him back into a human, whole. With the return of his body and the loss of omniscience and omnipotence within the domain, the mods would remain with him just as they had during the transfer. The core would remain under the supervision of the School of Overseers. The choice was not urgent, but eternal. Alden went off to think, and he thought for 3 days, thinking not in currents, but with his feet as Ansel had taught him. He traveled across the entire country. He stood by the well he had built first. He sat on the wall of Olkovi Broad, where he had once counted 400 campfires. He listened as the school children chanted the names from the memorial books in unison, and his name was simply one among them. The country lived on. It no longer needed a god from the core. It needed what every home needs, for people to live in it. On the 4th day, he entered the current for the last time. He embraced the entire domain as one does before setting out on a journey. He checked every seam and every patch. He handed over the keys and regulations to the School of Caretakers and left in the core a single line of his own above all the rules, and the line stated that no one in this world should be left alone to face erasure. Then he said yes to the core. The return was pain, and it was birth. He woke up on the grass by the northern mountain under the real sky, and the first thing he felt was weight. The second was the grass beneath his palms. The third was hunger, simple, deafening, human hunger. He laughed as he lay there and laughed for a long time. The panel obediently unfolded before his eyes. Strength 180. Dexterity 170. All the icons glowed green. The player remained a player. It was just that the game had ended, but life had not. Everyone was waiting for him at the foot of the mountain. Brant held the horse's reins. Jaros held an open book and solemnly recorded in it the return of citizen Alden Varen to the ranks of the living. Ansel stood next to the students and squinted into the sun. They rode home across the entire country, and people came out onto the road, yet no one fell to their knees because the law of the land was being upheld. In Dornhall, on the square by the first well, tables were set up from wall to wall. The air smelled of bread. Music blared. The baker hung up a third sign announcing that he was now baking for free. That evening, Alden sat at the head of the table between Cassian and Ansel and looked out at his city. Somewhere in the crowd, Tob was tossing his daughter into the air. Viscount Tavin was arguing with Mara about taxes, and both were enjoying themselves. Yule was telling the children about the world beyond the door, and the children listened as if to a fairy tale with a happy ending, because that's exactly what it was. Cassian leaned toward him and asked quietly if he regretted his omniscience. Alden thought for a moment and answered honestly. Omniscience sees every leaf. A person sees a tree. The tree is more beautiful. At night, when the festivities had died down, he climbed alone onto the castle wall to the spot where the once beggar baron had once looked out over the weed-choked fields and counted his 12 men. Now, beneath the stars, light stretched all the way to the horizon. 4 cities, roads, and stations lay just beyond the gate, along with 10,000 sleeping people, each of whom was recorded in someone's book and was therefore real. He had once died in one world for changing the rules of the game. He had nearly been erased in another for the same reason. And in the end, it turned out that it isn't cheaters who change the rules. The rules are changed by people who decide not to leave each other alone. The trends merely gave him a head start. Everything else was built by hands whose names he didn't even know. Alden Varen stood there a little longer, breathing in the night air that was so sorely lacking in the core's currents. Then he climbed down from the wall, walked through the sleeping courtyard past the first well, and headed home to sleep. Just to sleep. For the first time in both his lives, he didn't have to rush anywhere. The story of the player and the glitch ended here. The story of the house continued, but it no longer needed a narrator. Houses know how to live on their own. That's why they're built.